Marek, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book 4, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 19. Kara seized Escher before Marek could reach him, holding him in place and weathering vicious snarls as Escher tried to break free of him. Crimson ringed Escher's deep blue irises, a warning sign that Marek wasn't going to take lightly. "Get him the fuck away from here," he snapped at Karis, because if he didn't, Escher was going to rip Katerina to shreds. Marek couldn't let that happen. "A fucking demon!" Escher bared fangs at Karis, the scarlet band in his irises growing as he kicked at Karis's legs, leaving marks on his black slacks. "She hurt him! She hurt—" Karis and Escher disappeared in a swirl of black smoke. All of the tension that had been building inside Marek flooded out of him, and he reached out to his left and gripped the newel post next to Ares to keep himself upright. Ares just looked at him, giving him the same one that Diamond, Callistos, and Valen were leveling on him. "She has information." It was a reasonable excuse for Marek wanting to keep her out of Escher's claws. "He would have torn her apart." "She in the basement?" Diamond looked beyond him to the junction in the corridor that led down to it. Marek nodded. "She's out cold." "I'll wake her up." Valen cracked his knuckles. Ares tossed him a black look. "No violence. She isn't liable to talk if we're rough with her. She isn't liable to talk at all. You don't understand." Marek moved into the corridor to block the way to the basement because he needed his brothers to know what they were dealing with. He needed to see they understood everything. Not just the fact Katerina was sick, but that pushing him right now was dangerous. He wanted to hurt her, but he needed to keep her safe. Right now, he was torn in two directions by the same instinct. He wasn't sure what he might do if his brothers laid a hand on her, and he didn't want to find out. "I think she's infected with demon blood. I still don't get the feeling that she's a demon. It just isn't there. My gut doesn't react to her as it does with demons, but sometimes my instincts kick in when I'm near her. When Father's blood in my veins is at the helm, I can feel the demon in her." Marek looked between his brothers, and Diamond and Valen exchanged a look. Callistos leaned against the wooden wall. "I don't feel it either. If you told me there was a demon in the basement, I wouldn't believe you." "Escher would say otherwise," Diamond put in. "Escher reacted because he saw I was hurt, and because the darkness is always at the helm with him." Marek was confident of that. "You told him about Katerina, didn't you?" Diamond gave him a sheepish look. Ares huffed. Valen shook his head. "There was a reason I didn't want him to know, Diamond. Not yet." Not until he had figured out the truth, anyway. He still wasn't sure what he would do if it turned out she had been telling him the truth all along. She was becoming a demon. Fraternizing with a demon was a huge no-no in his father's eyes. Falling in love with one might just see him banished from the underworld and exiled from his family forever. Although the warmth and understanding in Ares' eyes said he might not lose everyone if he did lose his heart to Katerina. "You want to tell us about that mark on your back?" Ares nodded towards it, his dark eyebrows dipping low as his lips compressed. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like a ward." Marek tried to look at it. "It is a ward. The Wraith carved the damn thing on me with that blade of his. The illusionist seemed pretty pleased to have me as her guest, with a ward scrawled into my skin." Diamond moved closer and peered at his back. "If that is a ward and it was written by the Wraith, then we need it off you. Escher can feel the Wraith when he's close because of what happened to him, and I'm guessing that means you'll probably experience the same pain as he does now whenever the Wraith is nearby. I also have a theory that it works both ways." "The Wraith will know when he's close to Marek?" Ares looked as if he was chewing a wasp as he said that, and the gold and red in his irises blazed like the fire he commanded as he glared at the mark on Marek's shoulder. "It's just a theory," Diamond said, his voice level but not enough to hide the note of concern in it. Marek wasn't going to dance around the subject. "If the Wraith can feel me and possibly the ward, and let's just agree he probably can, then I need it off me as soon as possible." Because the wards around the castle were strong, but they weren't designed to repel demons, making it impossible for them not to enter the grounds. They were designed to weaken demons and alert him and his brothers when the wards were penetrated, giving them a heads up so they were ready for a fight. He looked at Aries as something hit him. "You knew I was here." His big brother shrugged. "I felt the ward's trigger." "We all did." Valen leaned his right shoulder against the wall. "Figured it was because you brought your girlfriend here for a dirty weekend." Marek leveled him with a black look. He was getting tired of Valen constantly poking that sore spot. "She isn't my girlfriend." His black look became a full-blown glare when Valen just shrugged that off, and he wanted to punch him for it. "She still doesn't feel like a demon to me. There's demon blood in her for sure, but I'm beginning to, well, I'm not really sure what I believe anymore." He went in circles about it, and it was getting tiring. "The wards on the cells are still in place." Aries sounded worried. Marek could understand why. He had brought Katerina to this place, one he and his brothers hadn't visited as a group in a long time, one they had thought the enemy didn't know about, and now there was a potential enemy in the basement. Gods, he hoped she wasn't one of them, but what did he know? He couldn't trust her. She had helped him escape, but it could have all been an act, one designed to bring them closer together or make him trust her, or do something to endanger everyone. Like bringing her to a stronghold where all of his brothers would come to see him. A stronghold that didn't have the defenses of the Tokyo mansion. "Valen, Cal, we need to shore up the wards here." He looked at both of them, making sure they were listening because both of them had a tendency to misread the gravity of a situation and treat it lightly. Diamond sighed. "I'll go with them." "Thanks." Marek watched them go, listening to them teasing each other about who could make the best wards. When their voices disappeared and he was alone with Aries, Marek's focus shifted to the floor beneath his feet, and beyond it to the basement. Was Katerina all right? She was weak enough already, and the thought of the wards draining her strength further because of her demon blood had his gut churning, heart aching with a need to check on her. He hardened it. For all he knew, she was the enemy, and this was an attempt to infiltrate their ranks. "We need to get that off you." Aries moved around behind him, and Marek could feel the heat of him as he leaned closer to get a better look at the ward. Marek nodded. "I can feel it healing again, dampening my powers. Damn thing will stop me from teleporting soon. I might need to rely on you guys if anything goes down." Aries nodded. "Valen and Cal will have your back. If it's an emergency, I'll step with you." Marek wanted to say something about taking Katerina too, but held his tongue. Aries wouldn't agree to that. His brother had heart and clearly understood what Marek was going through, but there was no way he would allow any threat to come with them to somewhere else where they might be tracked again because of her. "When Karis returns, I'll have him draw the power out of it and undo it." He reached over his shoulder and pulled on it as he twisted his head, trying to see the extent of the damage. He scowled when he saw several of the curving splashes had cut through his favor mark, into the dusky branches of the circle of trees. "Bastards. It's not as bad as it looks." Aries gave him a tight smile. "It will heal up nicely once we get rid of the ward. There is another less elegant way of doing it. I can burn it out." Marek's stomach turned at just the thought of his brother searing his flesh deeply enough to destroy the ward. It would do the job, and Marek would heal from it, but he was damned if he was going to pick it over waiting for Karis. What Karis would do would hurt enough. What Aries proposed would be agony that would last for hours, and would probably have him waking in a cold sweat each day for months after reliving it in his sleep. Aries had burned something off him before, ink that he'd done on his right forearm in the heat of the moment, before the vampire bitch had betrayed him. He wasn't sure he wanted to go through that hell again, feeling as if his entire body was about to catch fire and burn to ashes, smelling the stench of his own burning flesh, seeing the guilt on Aries' face as he heard him. "I can wait." Marek turned his face to him and smiled, hoping his brother would see that he didn't want to put him through that again. "How did you break the ward to get here?" He sighed, and his focus slipped to the basement again. "Katerina came to me. She had a knife. I didn't trust her at first, but she seemed, I don't know. I don't know whether I'm meant to trust her or treat her like the enemy." And it was tearing him apart. Had she really wanted to help me, or is this all another lie? He looked to his brother, needed him to answer that question for him because whenever he tried, his answer kept changing. Aries lifted his hand and looked as if he wanted to lay it on Marek's bare shoulder, And then his face crumpled and he scrubbed his hand over his tawny hair instead, tugging some of the overlong strands from the thong that held it tied back. I don't have the answer to that question. I wish I did. The one who can answer it for you is dealing with Escher. Marek frowned, and then his eyes slowly widened. Why hadn't he thought of that? Karis could read Katerina's mind. But Karis was also the only thing standing between Katerina and certain death right now. As much as Marek wanted him here, to look into her memories and to remove the ward on his back, he needed his brother in Tokyo more. Karis could stop any of them from teleporting with nothing more than a touch and a flex of his powers, and he was the only one who possessed that ability. He was going to have to attempt to uncover the truth the traditional way, by questioning Katerina and looking for a lie in every word she spoke, and in the way her body reacted. His senses were strong enough to detect spikes in her heartbeat or tremors in her voice. Although she was sick, and the wards on the castle were probably draining what little strength she did have. Could he really tell if she was lying to him? He hadn't been able to tell up to this point, so what made him believe he could detect a lie in her now? He was still blinded by his feelings for her, both the side of him that viewed her as a demon he needed to eradicate, and the side that desperately needed to protect her and believe her. He was too close to this. Aries' expression softened, a hint of concern coloring it. You don't need to be there. Marek shook his head. I do. She's weak. I don't want her pushed too hard, and she will be if she's faced with all of you. And no him. It would panic her, and gods, he couldn't bear the thought of her becoming overwrought with fear. She was too weak from whatever was happening to her. It would probably kill her. Valen and Callistos returned, looking almost like twins in their standard black t-shirt, fatigues, and heavy boots. Only Valen's new shocking violet hair color made them stand apart, and the color of their eyes. They jostled and grinned at each other, clearly amused by something. Diamond trailed along behind them, tugging at the collar of his navy roll neck. A roll neck that was wet. Marek looked his younger brother over, from his wet white hair that stood up in haphazard spikes as if he had run his fingers through it, trying to make it look as it normally did, to the navy long sleeve and black jeans that stuck to his skin. What the hell happened? Aries looked him over too. Someone tried to make a ward on the rocks. You know the ones near the southern end of the island? Callistos grinned as he looked back over his shoulder at a disgruntled Diamond. They were a bit slippery. Hey, maybe he just wanted to cool off and have a swim. Valen pivoted on his heel and walked backwards, facing Diamond. Although you certainly cooled off with all those ice chunks forming around you. That's enough. Aries pushed past both of them and shook his head as he looked Diamond over. You want me to dry you off? Diamond burrowed into the collar of his top. I'll change, thanks. He took the wooden stairs 2 at a time, heading upwards, and disappeared from view around the corner. Valen smirked. Not another word. Aries scowled at him. You've had your fun. Valen looked as if he wanted to fight Aries on that. Marek braced himself for the usual explosive outcome of Aries exerting some command over Valen. Cal eased back a step, clearing room for the fight. Valen frowned and then huffed and shrugged it off. Whatever. That was anticlimactic. Marek stared at Valen, not sure what to make of this new version of his brother. He wanted to tease him about the effect Eva was having on him, leveling out his mood and smoothing his sharper edges. But he knew that if he did that, Valen would bring up Katerina and call her his girlfriend again to taunt him. He was beginning to doubt she would ever be that for him, even if she was telling the truth. Diamond trudged back down the stairs, dressed in a pair of navy sweats and a long-sleeved dark gray t-shirt. His gloves glittered with frost that cracked as he curled his fingers and flexed them. I don't have a spare pair, he muttered to Aries as he reached the bottom step. Come here. Aries held his hands out. One dryer coming right up. A heat haze rose from Aries' hands as his eyes brightened, the flecks of red and gold in them shimmering. Diamond held his hands out a good 6 inches above them, turning them over several times to dry all of his gloves. When they were done, Diamond stared at them, a distant look in his pale blue eyes. Toasty. When was the last time Diamond had felt warm? Years ago, he had confessed that even in the high heat of summer, he was racked with chills from time to time, and that the warmth didn't feel right to him. It felt cloying, choking. Did he ever feel warmth like Marek and his brothers could? Was it ever pleasant to him? The look in his eyes said that Aries' heat was pleasant and that he enjoyed it. "Are we gonna meet your girlfriend?" Valen grinned when Marek scowled at him. "No violence." He looked at each of his brothers in turn and waited for them to nod. Diamond was the last to do it. Marek turned away from his brothers and led the way down the spiral staircase, his breaths loud in the narrow space as he fought to settle his nerves. He had only left her barely half an hour ago, but he wasn't sure what to expect. When he reached the door, he peered in through the small barred window again. Relief crashed through him as he found her curled up on her side, her eyes open and her breathing rapid but steady. "Katerina," he murmured. She tensed and her gaze jerked to him. "Where am I?" Her voice sounded stronger. The relief flowing through him grew stronger with it. He slid the bolt on the door across and opened the heavy iron panel. He entered slowly, aware of her gaze on him and that her heart was picking up pace. Fear tainted her scent. Her eyes leaped to beyond him. He looked back at Aries and Diamond and glared at them as he subtly shook his head. She needed time to adjust to where she was and to him. She didn't need 4 warriors piling into the room with him. Not when Diamond looked ready to deal some violence, even when he had sworn not to. The overhead light buzzed on, flickering and making a plinking sound. Katerina squinted up at it and then covered her eyes. "You're safe, Katerina." "I don't feel safe." She curled into a ball and then suddenly exploded into a sitting position, her eyes wild. "Guillaume!" Her face crumpled and tears dashed down her cheeks as she sagged, rolled forwards and hung her head between her legs. The shaking started again, but he knew that this time it wasn't because of the demon blood in her veins. She was worried about her brother. She should be worried about herself. Marek eased to a crouch a few feet from her, keeping enough distance between them that she couldn't reach him before he could move. Not that he expected her to attack him. She was too busy holding herself together, and the strength that had shot through her was quick to wane again, leaving her trembling violently as she stared at him. Something fierce slowly built in her wild hazel eyes, something fueled by a desperation that he could sense in her. She was skirting the edge, liable to work herself into a frenzy before they could get any answers if he let her continue. He needed to keep her in the room with him, focused on him, and not on whatever terrible things she was imagining. "Katerina, I need you to tell me everything, starting with what the Wraith and the Illusionist wanted you to do." Her eyes leaped to his, and she lunged forwards, which had Diamond and Aries suddenly in the room, towering over her as they flanked him. She looked up at them, gaze leaping between them, her fair eyebrows furrowing as she shrank back. She pulled her feet up onto the cot and pressed her back to the dark stone wall. Her focus slowly fell back on Marek. "Why did you help me?" Marek held her gaze, part of him wanting to tell his brothers to back off, the rest of him deeply aware of how much he needed them there, right beside him. A reminder that this was an interrogation, and that his mission was to uncover information on their enemy and his loyalty was to his family, not to Katerina. She looked at his brothers again where they loomed over her. Her lips compressed and she swallowed hard. "Why did you help me?" He tried again. She looked back at him, something dawning in her eyes, the same wild need that had made her lunge for him and that made sense as she spoke. "Help Guillaume," she husked in Catalan and eased forwards, the look in her eyes revealing how much she wanted to reach for him, wanted to take hold of him, because she needed to know he was listening to her. "Help Guillaume and I'll tell you. Whatever you want to know." He could see how important that was to her, how much she loved her brother and feared for him. And it struck him that she had risked a lot by helping him, if she had actually helped him and it hadn't been another trick. "They said," she hiccuped on a sob, switching to English now as she flicked a glance at all his brothers. "They would save him. But now, if they'll kill him. I know it." Had she done all of this because she had wanted to cure her brother? If she had, then she had jeopardized everything to save Marek. Presuming her rescue had been real and not another trick. Gods, he hated that he thought that whenever he started to believe something about her. He cursed Escher. If his brother hadn't flipped his switch, Karis would have been here and this would have been so much smoother. Karis could have taken a look into her mind and told them everything. "Who's Guillaume?" Diamond looked down at him. Marek didn't take his eyes off Katerina. "Her brother. He's a turned human." "A vampire?" Disbelief laced Aries' deep voice. Marek nodded. Katerina rocked forwards, wrapped her arms around her stomach, and grunted. Her face contorted and sweat beaded on her brow as her cheeks flushed deep red. "Is she sick? She looks sick." Cal sounded concerned. "It's the demon blood," Valen answered for Marek. "Probably fucking her up royally." Marek really hadn't needed to hear that, not when he was struggling to keep it together. Awareness of his four brothers building inside him, pulling at the side of him that felt compelled to protect Katerina whatever the cost. "Katerina, why did you help me?" He tried for a third time. She shook her head and lifted it, pain shining in her eyes as she wheezed. "Help Guillaume. Give you my address. Bring him here. Then I talk." She doubled over again and cried out, and it took all of his will to keep himself where he was and not go to her as he wanted. He couldn't do what she wanted. He had risked enough by bringing her to this safe house. He couldn't bring her brother here, too, not when he didn't know whether or not he was working for the enemy. They suspected a hellspawn was among their ranks, and he was one of that breed. But he had to do something for her brother, because she was serious and she wouldn't talk unless she knew her brother was safe. Part of him said to wait for Karis. Karis could brute force her mind and get the information out of her, although Marek wasn't sure she would survive such an assault in her weakened state. There was a chance she would resist, and that would cause her pain. Karis wasn't exactly gentle when extracting information, and with Katerina turning into a demon, his brother was liable to be rougher with her than normal. "Cal will go and tell him to get away from Barcelona," Marek offered, hoping it would be enough. She immediately shook her head and bit out, "No, bring here. I won't tell anything until I see my brother. Need him safe. Need him here." Her head lifted and the hurt and fear in her eyes cut at his restraint. "They'll kill him." Tears streaked down her cheeks. Damn it. Marek looked to Aries. Aries studied Katerina for a moment, his fiery eyes narrowed and intense, sharp as they took her in, and then they slid down to Marek. He nodded. "Cal," Marek said without taking his eyes off Katerina. "Go to this address." He nodded to Katerina. She recited her address. "Got it. I know a place near there I can land." Cal's voice cut off at the end, and Marek didn't need to look to know his brother had stepped. Katerina started to rock, holding her stomach. Her face paled, her eyes growing unfocused as she stared right through Marek. She was getting worse again. Fear for her brother was stripping away the strength she needed to survive the assault of the demon blood on her body. He could only hope that seeing her brother again would restore that strength, giving her a shot at surviving the night. The sound of boots hitting the stone floor had Marek looking over his shoulder. Cal's expression was grave as he looked down at him. He wasn't there. Katerina lunged from the cot and collapsed into a heap on the flagstones. She muttered desperate things to herself, clawed towards him, and froze when Aries stepped in front of Marek, blocking her path to him. She looked up the height of Aries at the same time as Marek did. "I won't talk. Find Guillaume." Aries' face hardened, his eyebrows dipping low and the corners of his mouth turning downwards. He stared down at Katerina, but his words were meant for Marek. "Get some air." Marek swallowed hard, the more rebellious part of himself screaming at him to deny that order and stay right where he was. The rest of him didn't want to witness what was about to happen. Time was up for Katerina. Diamond's eyes glittered with white, as hard as diamonds as he frowned down at Katerina and closed ranks with Aries. She tossed Marek a panicked glance as his brothers formed a wall between them. Marek stared at her, his brow furrowed, the war raging out of control inside him. He knew what needed to be done, but the thought of his brothers forcing her to talk, the thought of her being alone with them, had him dangerously close to slipping into a black rage. "I'm out of here. I can't stand here and watch this going down." Callistos moved back a step into the corridor, and Marek was glad that he wasn't the only one who was against what Diamond and Ares were about to do, even when he knew in his heart it was the only way. They needed information, and it was better she gave it up herself without Karis forcing his way into her memories. There was a better chance of her coming out of Ares and Diamond's interrogation than there was of her surviving Karis's intrusion into her mind. "Valen, come shoot some pool with me in the games room like old times. Leave the older brothers to deal with this shit." Valen scoffed. "I'm older than Diamond." "Yeah, but you don't act like it. Diamond is like 8,000 in spirit age. He acts older than Dad." Marek caught the glare Diamond leveled on Callistos over his shoulder. "Sure," Valen said, "but only because I'm going to run some errands first. We need food and water. She needs it. We'll get the place up and running." Marek looked at Katerina. She needed sustenance, but she needed water most of all. They hadn't offered him anything to eat or drink when he had been captive in that house, and he doubted Katerina had been treated any better. "I'll get her water and food." Marek pushed to his feet and backed away from her, each step agony as she stared at him, her eyes growing wild again, fear brewing in them. "I won't be long." He couldn't bring himself to look at Ares and Diamond as he turned away at the door, his heart heavy in his chest, sinking deep into his stomach as he heard the iron door closing. He hurried up the stairs after Valen and Callistos, thankful that both of them were silent, as deep in thought and as uncomfortable with what was about to go down as he was. When they reached the top of the stone spiral staircase, Valen stopped and looked at him, placed a hand on his bare shoulder and squeezed it. "I'll step to the nearest town and get supplies. Get some air. It'll do you good." Valen's golden eyes softened, revealing a side of him that rarely showed. "Believe me, I know how shitty this is. Fuck, maybe I don't. Eva had Megan there with her when Karis questioned her. And Eva hadn't been turning into a demon. Katerina was alone with two gods she didn't know, warriors who had a duty to eliminate the threat to the gates, and who were deeply protective of Marek. I need to go back to her, because he couldn't let her face them alone. He went to turn, but Valen held him firm, stopping him. "Just get some air. Give them 10 minutes, as long as it takes for me to bring some water back. Then you can go back down there and intervene. If she hasn't started talking in 10 minutes, she won't start talking." Marek had to force himself to nod. It went against everything he wanted, but he made himself move further away from her, trailed out of the castle as Valen teleported and Callistos went to the boiler room. He pushed the heavy wooden door open. The scent of salt and peat hit him, laced with seaweed and heather. He breathed deeply of it as he paused in the late afternoon light, letting it ease the chill from his bones. The sea lapped at the sloping dark gray rocks that formed the edge of the small island, a sound that was strange to him now after spending so long in the hills near Seville. Rather than insect song, the call of seabirds rang in his ears, cries that sounded as desperate as the one that had left Katerina's lips. Marek followed the path to the right of the entrance, where it gave way to grass that was soft and damp beneath his bare feet. He walked along the side of the long, tall gray castle, passing the arched windows, heading towards the rear where the grass gave way to rock. He stood on the point of the island and stared across the water that stretched between two hills, forming an entrance to the loch from the sea. Beyond the hills, in the distance across the dark water, the Isle of Skye was hazy despite the clear blue sky. Marek scanned the horizon, trying to focus on it rather than what was happening behind him in the small Scottish castle. To his left, the sun was slowly easing lower, on a direct course to set behind Skye. To his right, beyond the mountains, the sky was rapidly darkening, storm clouds rising high into it, catching the golden light. He tracked the building storm. It was heading towards them, coming south on cooler air. A lightning storm. Valen would love it. He sensed his brother return. Marek pivoted away from the rocks and walked back around the castle, pushed the door open and swung it hard as he entered so it slammed behind him. He took the bottle of water that Valen offered him, not slowing as he made a beeline for the stairs to the basement. He braced himself when he reached them, steeling his heart against whatever he was about to hear, knowing it would be bad. He couldn't let it get to him. Katerina had valuable information that they needed. He was sure that Ares didn't take any pleasure from what he was doing. although he couldn't say the same about Diamond. He paused at the top of the steps. No sound came from below. He frowned and ventured downwards, clutching the bottle of water so tightly he felt sure it would burst before he reached her cell. Marek hit the floor and rounded the corner, his heart beating faster now. A sickening hammering against his ribs as he focused on breathing, the anticipation of what he would find clawing at him, close to tearing him apart. Diamond stepped out of the cell, gave him a grim look, and strode past him. Marek blew out his breath and forced himself to keep moving forwards. He stepped into the room. Aries pushed to his feet and looked at him, his body twisting to reveal Katerina where she sat on the cot. Unharmed. The conflict reigning in Aries' eyes told him what he needed to know. Neither he nor Diamond had been able to make her talk, and neither had been willing to hurt her. "Give me a minute." Marek moved aside when Aries nodded and walked towards him. Katerina's gaze tracked his brother. He kept his focus on Katerina as his brothers left them alone, as he moved into the room and sank into a crouch in front of her. Her hazel eyes, red from her tears, finally left the open door behind him and came to settle on him. "I'm listening." He set the water down beside him, eased onto his backside in the middle of the floor between her and the door. "It won't be long before Karis comes back. If Aries and Diamond scare you, then what Karis will do to you." He couldn't bring himself to say it. Not when she tensed, that fear that seemed to be a constant in her eyes rapidly building again. Marek picked up the water and played with it, needing to do something with his hands. Her gaze dropped to it and her tongue poked out, flicked over her lip as she stared at the bottle as if it was her salvation. She was mistaken. Her salvation was the one holding the bottle. But he could only save her if she started talking. "Whatever you have to say, Katerina, now is the time to say it." Chapter 20. Katerina watched Marek playing with the water, wrestling with herself, torn between telling him what he wanted to know and demanding once again that he find Guillaume. His brothers hadn't been cruel to her, but they hadn't been kind either. Not like Marek was. They had threatened her, had spoken about taking her outside for a swim in the sea, one where she would be held under the water to see how long a demon could hold its breath. They had talked about seeing whether the waning sunlight would burn her now. Somehow she had stood firm throughout it all. But as she looked at Marek where he patiently sat before her, worry shining in his rich brown eyes, dark crescents beneath them speaking of his fatigue, she wanted to talk. She wanted to tell him everything because she didn't want him to hate her, not as his brothers clearly did. "Can you save Guillaume?" she whispered, her thoughts returning to her own brother. Where was he? Had the man and Lisabetta taken him captive? Was he already dead? She couldn't contemplate that, couldn't bear it. Marek sighed. "He's a vampire, Katerina. I don't think there's a way to reverse vampirism." "There has to be. They said they could save him." She burst forwards and regretted it when her head turned, causing her to sink back against the wall. Marek looked as if he wanted to come to her as she pressed a hand to her forehead. "Whatever they told you, it was probably just—" "Don't say it," she interjected, because she couldn't bear the thought that he was right, and they had only said what she had needed to hear to motivate her to do what they wanted. She couldn't bear it because if it was true, then she had done this for nothing. She had ruined everything she could have had with Marek for nothing. "You might be able to save yourself," he husked softly. She closed her eyes and shook her head as she buried it in her knees, drawing them up and hugging them. She refused to believe him. He was just trying to hurt her because of what she had done to him. "They swore they could save him." Her voice was muffled, but she knew he could still hear her clearly. "I can't have done this for nothing." A new feeling burst to life inside her, and she lifted her head and stared at Marek over her knees. "I have to go back. Maybe if I go back, I can make—" "There is no going back, Katerina." He cut her off this time. "They are going to know you assisted in my escape." She shook her head so hard her brain hurt. "I'll make them see it isn't the case. I'll say you took me captive." He chuckled, a low and cold sound that shredded her hope. "They won't believe you escaped from me, or that we didn't kill you. They will think you're a mole sent there by us to infiltrate them." Oh, God, could it get any worse? You can't save your brother. His deep voice was colder than she had ever heard it, sent a chill down her spine as she tried to shut out his words, desperate not to listen to them. I'm not sure you can save yourself either. She sagged into her knees, rested her forehead on them, and fought back the tears. Resignation swept through her, extinguishing the last of her fire. I don't want to be saved, then. She didn't want to live without Guillaume. She didn't want to live as a demon. She sank into the mire of her thoughts, drowning in them, choking as they closed in around her. In the darkness, a tiny spark flickered. No, she whispered and gripped her knees so hard her hands shook. I won't believe you. There has to be a way to save Guillaume. There just has to be. Katerina wearily lifted her head and fixed her gaze on Marek. I promised. I swore. She tried to get to her feet, but her legs buckled beneath her and she struck the side of the cot as she went down, sharp pain lancing her right hip and shooting up her back, ripping a cry from her throat. She gripped the bar of the cot and pushed up, refusing to give up, determined to save her brother, no matter the cost. Her breaths came faster, sawing from her lips as desperation and fear collided inside her, as pain tore through her bones and she felt as if they were going to break. The heat that had abated scalded her skin as she tried to walk, as she set her sights on the door. She could reach it. She could get away from this place and help her brother. She needed to help him. She wasn't sure what she was saying as she inched her feet forwards, as she wobbled and her vision wavered, darkness encroaching at the edges. She only knew that she had to reach that door. She had to save her brother. Her right leg gave out and she staggered sideways, hit the wall, and flinched as her head cracked off the stone. The darkness grew stronger, a throbbing, pulsing wave of heat accompanying it now, radiating across her skull. Marek grabbed her arm. She shoved him off her. No, I need to go. I can save him. She swayed to her left, but Marek was there, blocking her path to the door. His voice swam in her ears as she pushed at his bare chest, as she weakly pounded her fists against it, putting all of her strength into each blow. I promised, she gasped as her throat closed, as she fought for air and to push back against the rising wave inside her, one that felt as if it was going to destroy her when it broke, crushing her beneath the tremendous force of it. I swore. She couldn't breathe. She wheezed, frantically attempting to get air into her lungs. Katerina, Marek whispered, and it tore away the last of her strength, because she couldn't understand how he could still say her name with so much warmth, so much kindness after what she had done. She deserved his anger, his hatred. She broke down, the world spinning around her as she sank into the gloom, because there was no saving her brother, and there was no saving herself. Chapter 21. Marek caught Katerina as she collapsed, her desperate gasping breaths grating in his ears. She kept talking, repeating words about saving her brother, pleading him to let her go. He carefully pulled her into his arms and pressed his right hand to her forehead. She was burning up. He palmed her slick brow and focused, calling a power that he never used. It was weaker than the one Karis possessed, but he hoped it would be strong enough to help him with Katerina, because he feared she would hurt herself if he couldn't stop her, or worse, she would manage to escape somehow, mustering up enough strength to make it outside the wards and teleport, and she would get herself killed. Sleep, he murmured softly as her struggles slowed, as her words slurred together. He kept channeling that compulsion into her, trancing her into a deep sleep, one he hoped would be restful for her and would give her weak body and fragile mind time to recover from her ordeal. Marek grew aware of someone behind him as he lifted Katerina into his arms, satisfied that she wouldn't wake for a few hours. He ignored them and set her down on the cot, focusing on her even as part of him waited for his brother to say something about what he had just witnessed. He covered Katerina with a thin blanket, brushed her damp caramel hair from her dirt-smudged forehead and cheeks, and drank her in for a moment, waiting until he was sure she wouldn't stir before he finally broke contact with her. He turned and looked at Aries. His big brother filled the doorway, a shadow in his black t-shirt and jeans, formidable as he folded his thickly muscled arms over his broad chest. Did you learn anything new? Not the words he had expected to hear leaving Aries' lips. Marek wanted to fool himself into believing his brother hadn't noticed what he had done to Katerina, but awareness of it was there in his dark eyes, laced with a hint of surprise. Marek was sure he wasn't the only brother other than Karis who had a power other than the ones they all had in common. Maybe Aries hadn't inherited any of them from their parents. Karis had managed to get all of them. Nothing. He split his focus between Katerina and Aries, unable to give his brother the whole of his attention. Not when he was worried about her. Not when he felt useless, unable to help her. What she needed was to know her brother was safe, and that was the one thing he couldn't give her. All he could do was ask Callistos to try again and again, but he didn't have much hope that eventually Guillaume would appear. If it had been Marek in the Wraith's shoes, he would have taken Guillaume captive the moment he had discovered Katerina had escaped with his enemy. Guillaume was now leverage in a very dangerous game, and Marek felt sure it wasn't going to end well for the turned human. Or Katerina. I have to go back to New York, but I'll check in later. Aries glanced beyond him to Katerina before his dark eyes shifted to the ceiling of the damp cell, drawing Marek's focus there. Damon has gone to help Karis with Escher. Cal had to return to London to keep an eye on the gates now night is falling. Valen has agreed to deal with Rome and Seville, and I'll lend him a hand if he needs it. Now that his brother had mentioned the others, he realized they were gone. You've got maybe half a day, tops. Aries turned away from him. It's all I could buy you. Make it count. I won't be able to delay Karis for longer than that. With that, Aries stepped. The swirls of black smoke that he left in his wake hanging in the air for long minutes as Marek stared at them, slowly processing what his brother had done for him. Aries had sent his brothers away so Marek could have time alone with Katerina, a shot at getting her to talk without his brothers looming in the shadows, frightening her. His brother would never know how much Marek appreciated that. He looked back over his shoulder at her, although he was sure she wouldn't be waking any time soon. Not naturally, at least. He could bring her up from the deep slumber he had tranced her into any time he wanted, but for now he would let her rest. If she didn't wake before morning, he would rouse her, and hopefully she would be stronger, well enough to talk to him without working herself into another frenzy. He needed to give Karis something to go on when he arrived. If Karis knew the memories he was looking for, there was a chance he would be gentler with her, and the mind probe wouldn't hurt her too much. Marek shut the door behind him, slid the bolt across, and pressed his hand to the cold iron that separated him and Katerina. She had suffered enough because of him. The sight of her on the worn cot in a damp cell played havoc with him. He wanted her somewhere more comfortable, but none of his brothers would be pleased if they arrived to find her outside of the cell. Karis would rip him a new one. As much as he hated it, she had to remain locked inside it, at least until he had discovered the truth. He couldn't trust her again until he knew she wasn't working for the enemy. He closed his eyes and checked the wards on the cell. When he found a vital one was missing, he let the darkness inside him rise to the fore, so his fangs would emerge, and used one to slice his finger. He drew the mark on the stone wall in his blood, focusing on each stroke of the elaborate pattern to infuse his power into it, forming a new ward, one that would stop Katerina from being able to teleport while inside the castle. The ward would spread to affect all adjoining stones, a ripple effect that would see to it that every inch of the castle was bound by it. It wasn't strong enough to stop his brothers from teleporting, but it would stop a demon. He stared through the door at Katerina, forming a mission plan in his mind as he watched over her. She would rest until dawn, and then he would wake her if she hadn't arisen already, and he would see to it she was fed and had water. And then he would convince her to talk. He wasn't sure how he was going to achieve that, but he would make it happen somehow. Marek forced himself to leave her, trudged back up the spiral staircase to the main floor of the castle, and busied himself with unpacking the groceries Valen had brought as promised. He checked the refrigerator. It was cool but not cold, the device still settling in after being turned on for the first time in years. He was surprised it worked at all. He checked the stove next, watching the metal ring heating until it glowed red, and then switched it off. The bags Valen had dumped on the island in the middle of the large kitchen contained everything he needed, and not only things like water, soup, milk, and bread. There were things for females, too. Deodorant, soap, a pink washcloth. even a matching pink toothbrush and toothpaste, and a hairbrush. Marek shook his head at them. It was Eva's doing, softening those edges, bringing out the side of Valen that everyone thought had died with their sister. Marek appreciated the hell out of it, though, because he hadn't even thought about getting Katerina the basic necessities. Her cream camisole was dark with filth, and her jeans had been dirty in places. Maybe she would feel better if she was washed and dressed in warm, clean clothing. He added finding her something to wear to his list, and rifled through the store cupboard where he and his brothers tossed everything that didn't have a regular place in the castle. In the back of it, on a low shelf, he found a metal basin that was deep enough to hold a good amount of water, and a matching jug. He took them out and washed them, preparing them for Katerina. He selected a can of soup and a bottle of water, and lined them all up on the kitchen island with some liquid soap and the washcloth. He went to his bedroom, turned out half of his clothes, and realized none of them would fit her, and stalked up the hallway to Valen's bedroom. His brother wouldn't mind him borrowing some sweats for Katerina. He found a suitable black pair, carried it back to his room, and added a light gray t-shirt from his own clothes, because he was damned if Katerina would wear all of Valen's things. He wanted her dressed in something belonging to him. Possessive? Absolutely. Foolish? Probably. He ran the water into the basin in his bathroom, pleased to find it was warm now, and washed his face. He pulled another t-shirt from his drawers and tugged it on, and grabbed a pair of socks, too. Dressed and feeling more like his old self, he picked up the clothes for Katerina and took them downstairs. He placed them into one of the empty grocery bags together with the metal bowl and went down into the basement. He unlocked the door and opened it and set the bag down just inside the door, quietly so he didn't disturb Katerina. He paused and studied her, listening to her steady, soft breathing, reassuring himself that she was still sleeping soundly, getting the rest she needed to rebuild her strength. He headed back upstairs and warmed the soup, poured it into a thermos he found in a cupboard, and set it on a tray with a bottle of water and a plastic bowl. He filled another thermos with hot water so he could make tea or warm the water in the basin so she could wash. Satisfied that everything he could do was done, he took his haul to the cell and placed it next to the bag. He meant to leave, but one glance at Katerina had him staying. He closed the door and sank to his backside, pressing his shoulders against the cold iron panel as he stared at Katerina. What was he going to do now? She was turning into a demon, and she might have betrayed him, but he still felt something for her. He wasn't sure that anything could change that. He lost track of time as he went in circles, aware that he was never going to figure out what he was going to do, but unable to stop himself from thinking about it as he watched Katerina sleep. As birdsong broke the thick silence that hung over the castle like a shroud, Katerina finally stirred. She moaned and rolled onto her side, her face scrunching up as she curled into a ball. Marek waited, watching her, keeping an eye on her in case the panic that had gripped her before he had sent her to sleep seized her again, and preparing himself to go to her and offer her what little comfort he could. Her eyelids fluttered and then lifted, and sleep-filled hazel eyes slowly settled on him. "Katerina," he murmured softly, not wanting to scare her or panic her. She blinked and frowned, took in her surroundings, and the grogginess in her eyes suddenly lifted. He was before her in an instant, his right hand on her bare arm. He stroked it softly. "You're fine. Safe." He caressed her, watching the flare of panic subside as she looked at him. "Can you eat something?" He didn't wait for her to respond. He went to the tray and brought it over to her, setting it down on the cold stone floor near her head. He opened the bottle of water for her and then the thermos of soup. "It's chicken noodle. It's meant to be good for making humans feel better." He poured the soup into the bowl and lifted it so she could see it. She stared at it blankly, her voice small and leaving him feeling lousy as she spoke. "I'm not human. What does a demon eat to make itself feel better?" Her eyes lifted to lock with his, filled with resignation and laced with sorrow. "Blood? Souls?" She swallowed hard. "Children?" Tears lined her lashes and she looked away from him. Marek stroked her arm, unable to deny the need to comfort her. He focused on her, on where they touched, on her scent and her racing heartbeat, and waited. The coppery odor of demon didn't pour from her. The gut-swirling sensation of a demon being near him didn't hit him. She smelled like Katerina, felt like Katerina, was Katerina. "You don't feel like a demon to me." He watched his fingers as he stroked them down her bare skin, feeling no revulsion or need to hurt her. The darker part of him remained docile, relaxed by her presence even, by the fact that she was looking better again. "But I am one," she croaked. He couldn't deny that she was becoming one, not when he had seen her teleport, but that didn't make her a demon right now. "There's still time. Maybe we can reverse this infection and cure you." "Maybe." She chuckled mirthlessly, a cold and hollow sound that matched the bleak look in her eyes. "And maybe your brothers don't hate me because of my tainted blood. Maybe you don't hate me." The laugh that left her lips was bordering on hysterical this time. "Maybe Guillaume is going to be just fine." Marek lowered the soup, set it down on the tray, and fought to find the right thing to say. This was all too much for her. It was right there in her eyes. It hit him that he did believe her. He believed everything she had said to him. She hadn't wanted to become a demon, and she hadn't wanted to hurt him. She didn't want to be a demon. Anger surged inside him, burning up his blood, because there was nothing he could do for her, except maybe take her mind off things and show her that he didn't hate her. She should hate him. He was the reason they had done this to her. It was his fault that she was turning into a demon and her entire world had been turned upside down. She had asked him things when he had met her, things he hadn't wanted to tell her because he hadn't told them to anyone. But if he could take her mind off what was happening to her and could form a new connection between them again by lowering the barriers, he would do it. He would put himself through that pain. For her. Chapter 22. "You asked me once why I hunt vampires. Do you still want to know?" Katerina nodded. It was subtle, but the interest that flared in her eyes wasn't. He was really going to do this, wasn't he? Marek wasn't sure how she would react to some of the things he had to say, but he needed it out there now, no longer a secret he closely guarded, just like his heart. He wanted her to know this about him. He craved that connection with her again. "A few centuries ago, I made what had to be my greatest mistake." He twisted to sit on his backside beside the cot. "I fell in love with a vampire. Erlia. She was beautiful and I was young. And an idiot. She wooed me, seduced me, filled my head with compliments from the moment we met at a social gathering in one of the regions of the underworld where the vampires live." He did his best to ignore the way Katerina scowled at him, because he was too afraid he would read into it and fool himself into believing she felt things that were no longer true. "I fell hard for her, and he had fallen even harder for Katerina." "Were your family angry?" Katerina slowly sat up, a small frown forming a crease between her eyebrows. There was a smudge of dirt just above that crease, darting towards her hairline on the left side. Marek shook his head. "Vampires are accepted by my father." "But demons aren't." Her voice was small again, and she looked away. He wanted to tell her that it would all work out, but he didn't want to lie to her. He didn't know what happened now, and even though he wanted to set things right for her, he didn't know if he could. The one who would know for sure was his father, and he wasn't about to ask him whether Katerina could be cured. Hades was liable to kill her on sight, or possibly even kill him. At the very least, Marek might end up incarcerated in one of the unsavory areas of the underworld for a century or two, until Katerina was long dead and his father believed him free of her taint. "What happened with her?" Katerina's gentle voice lured him out of his dark thoughts and back to her. "Something terrible must have happened to make you spend centuries hunting vampires." "We had been together for years, and I had come to the decision that I wanted her to be my wife. I went to ask her as much." He closed his eyes and did his best not to relive that night. "When I reached her family home, I saw her on the patio with 3 males, all vampires. All of them were clearly familiar with her in an intimate way. I was furious, ready to tear them to pieces for touching what I considered mine, my wife. He opened his eyes and sighed as he looked at the damp stone floor, as her high laughter rang in his mind and seared his heart all over again. I was about to intervene when she started talking about me, discussing how she was sure I was close to being completely hers, and they were going to get what they wanted. Not that she was going to get what she wanted, but that the four of them were. He tipped his head back, deeply aware of Katerina's gaze on his face as he lost himself in his past. It turned out that she had been playing me all along, telling me what I wanted to hear so she could secure me, and in turn secure the wealth and privilege that came with me, and an entire estate that was as large as the realm where the vampires resided. He lowered his gaze to Katerina. She intended to set up buildings on it for the three vampires, houses where they could host grand parties during my absences, debauched gatherings at my expense that I would never know about. He rubbed his forearm where the ink he'd had done to honor her had once been, the self-hatred he tried to keep at bay bubbling up inside him as he forced himself to continue, so Katerina would understand him. She never loved me. I was a game to her, a way of achieving something for the men she did love. She hated me. She hated it when I touched her. She hated it when I... He couldn't bring himself to say any more, not when the anger and pity, the rage and despair built inside him so swiftly he wanted to scream. What happened? Katerina edged closer to him, concern in her eyes that brightened them, chasing away some of the sorrow and resignation. At least he was taking her mind off her own situation, giving her some respite from it. I lost it when she spoke of drugging me to keep me compliant, to ensure I didn't notice what was happening around me, and keep me under her spell. I don't remember much, only pain and raw fury. And blood. I killed the three men. And I killed her. I killed that entire nest of vampires, and it wasn't enough. She had revealed their true nature to me, and it birthed something inside me. Or maybe awoke something. And that something had been born of his father's blood in his veins. No one betrayed Hades and lived to tell the tale. You've hunted vampires ever since? He nodded and hesitated, because while hunting vampires was one thing, what he was about to admit was something entirely darker, and he wasn't sure how she would react. Marek swallowed hard. It's a compulsion. A sickness. It was strange to call it that, to admit that what he had was a disease, an affliction that he was now certain had no cure. I can go maybe a few weeks at most before the need to hunt and kill vampires becomes too much and steals control of me. If I don't obey it, if I don't satisfy it, it's like an itch I have to scratch, and I would go mad if I didn't do it. He had managed to make it to 6 weeks once, and he had felt as if he had been losing his mind, hadn't been able to recognize the thing he had become. It had been a foolish attempt to break the cycle, and it had almost broken him. That was why you were so angry that night, when we met. She pulled her knees up to her chest and hugged them, the dark blankets still in place over them. I ruined your hunt, and killed most of the remaining vampires, and you didn't get to scratch that itch. He nodded. When it has me in its grip, I don't like who I am. I enjoy it while it's happening. The hunt, the fight, the kill. I love every second of it. It's the aftermath. It's like a high. But there's a part of me that knows it's a high that will only get harder to find the more I hunt vampires. At first, I was satisfied with 1 or 2 kills when the need gripped me. Now I'm only satisfied if I can kill 10 or 20 vampires. How long before I'm only satisfied when I kill 30? He wasn't sure he wanted to find out the answer to that question. He needed to find a way to let go of his pain before it reached that point, because it wasn't healthy. It wasn't healing him. It was keeping all of his pain alive inside him, a writhing, black, and terrible thing that was slowly destroying him. I'm sorry, she whispered. Marek frowned at her, confusion sweeping through him. For what? That I'm compelled to kill vampires. You suffer the same compulsion. Maybe that's what I wanted to show you. That we aren't so different. She shook her head and her brow furrowed.
I'm sorry I betrayed you too.
The tears that had been threatening began to fall as the strength and fire he admired in her crumbled under the weight of everything that had happened.
What they wanted me to do, I meant to go through with it, and I'm sorry about that.
You meant to go through with it, he murmured, mulling that over, and shifted so he was facing her. What made you change your mind?
When we fought the demons, when you kissed me, I wanted so badly that you would keep kissing me like that, even though I was becoming something you were born to kill.
She picked at the blanket covering her knees, her eyes on her fingers now. And instead of continuing to kiss her, he had lashed out at her, tried to choke her. I'm sorry about what I did, Katerina, he husked, and didn't hesitate to reach out and place his hand on her knee between hers. She stared at it now, and gods, he wanted her to take it. He wanted her to show him that he hadn't fucked everything up with her. He wanted to laugh at that. It was already all screwed up. He wasn't even sure he could unscrew it.
After what happened, I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't pick between you and my brother.
She closed her eyes, tilted her head, and rested her cheek on his hand. Heat swept through him, the warmth of her soft skin invading his bones, easing the tension from his muscles, as he savored the way she was trusting him and seeking comfort from him. Maybe there was hope for them after all.
What's going to happen to Guillaume?
She whispered. I don't know. I'll go again later to see if he's come back. I'll do whatever I can to get him away from my enemy. He didn't hold out much hope of finding Guillaume, though.
Why do they want to hurt you?
She edged her hand towards his, and his eyes slipped shut as she made contact, as her thumbs brushed his skin. They want to destroy the gates I protect with my brothers. If they can manage it, they will merge this world and the underworld to create a new realm they intend to rule. He opened his eyes and looked off to his left, to the small window in the door of the cell and beyond it. If it happens, it would be a hellish world. I can see it sometimes. A curse from the Moirai, the three goddesses of fate. Their method of keeping myself and my brothers focused on our mission. We can see what will happen if we fail.
Don't fail.
She wrapped her fingers around his and pressed her cheek to the back of his hand.
This world can be cruel, and humans are intent on ruining it, but it has beauty too, and kindness.
She frowned at his hand.
Is your world hellish?
He shook his head. No. It's a dark realm carved from obsidian in most places, but it has beauty and kindness too. The good souls go there as well as the bad. There are incredible valleys that are as green as anything in this world, lush with nature of a different sort. Mother sees to that.
What happens to a demon soul when it dies? Does it go there?
A tear slipped from her cheek, hitting his skin and burning him. Marek lifted his other hand and brushed his fingers over her hair, sweeping it back from her face. Don't think about dying, Katerina. Because he couldn't bear it. Just the thought of her dying had his heart ready to break.
I feel like I'm dying,
she murmured. He pressed his hand to her brow. You're not burning up anymore, and you seem brighter, more lucid. I think the demon blood hits you in waves, and when the storm recedes, you are changed a little more. Is teleporting your only ability? She shook her head against his other hand and edged her eyes up to settle on his face.
I can see colors, too.
Colors? It was an odd thing to say.
Like black when you were angry with me, and red at times. I saw them on people. When they were talking, the colors changed. It's weird, and I don't like it.
She lifted her head and toyed with his fingers.
I think I'm seeing emotions.
Emotions? He mulled that one over, too, and could only think of one explanation. Where did the blood come from?
He said it was a cocktail of their blood.
A cold shiver danced down his spine on hearing her confirm his suspicions. They had a demon who could teleport. He died. The one who gave you the demon blood killed him before we could get anything out of him. Marek slowly eased his hand out from beneath hers, hating himself for fearing she might have inherited other powers from Amori's blood, the power to steal Marek's command over the earth. There was a succubus, too. It might explain the ability to see emotions.
A succubus?
Her eyes widened, horror flaring in them.
Like something that feeds on...
A blush climbed her cheeks. Something like that. He ignored that heat that scalded his own face and recalled what Valen had told him about Jinn. She had other powers, too. She could cast a barrier, which would be useful for Katerina. Together with the ability to teleport, she would be able to protect herself well. There's also a woman we call Illusionist. She was with the Wraith.
Lisabetta?
She cut him off and he frowned at her.
She has weird eyes and dark purple hair that's almost black.
He nodded. That's her. She's called Lisabetta.
The man called her that. What can she do?
He could see the cogs and wheels turning in her mind as curiosity shone in her eyes. She was trying to figure out what other abilities she might gain as the demon blood took hold in her. She can shift to appear like other people, can mimic them right down to their voice and scent, which was another handy ability that would keep her safe if she could master it.
And the man?
She moved the blanket off her legs and scowled at her dirty cream top and jeans. He's a wraith. I brought you clean clothes and some things so you can wash. He moved to the bag and opened it, took out the sweats and the t-shirt. I won't look. He turned his back to her and busied himself with filling the basin with the hot water and mixing in some cold. The sound of material rustling behind him had him aching to peek, but he somehow found the will to resist. Katerina didn't make it easy. The cream camisole hit the stone floor just beyond the tray, and her jeans followed it, quickly enough that it was obvious she was now only in her underwear. Marek swallowed hard. He topped up her soup, hoping to warm it with the remains in the thermos.
Done.
Katerina sounded even brighter, and an arrow of pride shot through him, an unfamiliar satisfaction that he found addictive. He had done something for her, something that had made her feel better. He turned towards her, and she was wearing his t-shirt. It was too large for her, dwarfing her slender frame, but gods, he liked the sight of her wearing it. He offered the soup, and she took it this time, chased the noodles around the bowl with the spoon, and took little bites.
What powers does a wraith have?
She paused and looked at him over the bowl.
He had fangs.
He's like a vampire, but he needs souls for nourishment, not blood. She shuddered and pulled a face.
I hope I don't develop any of his abilities then.
He offered her the water, and she handed him the bowl. He set it down on the tray and thought about the wraith, about the abilities they knew he possessed. He can make portals, too, and can steal memories from fragments of a person's soul. Her fair eyebrows drew down.
When he... Do you think he...
He shrugged. Most likely. She didn't want to mention that the wraith had stabbed him in the back, and most likely had his memories now, and he didn't really want to talk about it either. He had been enjoying just being with her, without thinking about what had happened. He idly rubbed his left shoulder, feeling the grooves of the ward through his t-shirt. He needed Karis to look at it as soon as his brother arrived, because it was almost healed. He doubted he could step now if he needed to do it, and he could feel his connection to the rock and earth around him had waned, was weak now. It wouldn't be long before it disappeared, locked down by the ward. His strength would probably follow it. He tensed as his senses spiked and looked at the ceiling. One of his brothers had just returned. Another followed, and then another.
What is it?
Katerina lowered her water to her lap. I have to go for a while. My brothers are here. He stood and brushed his damp backside down, went to turn and hesitated. He looked down at Katerina, not liking the way she curled into herself again, drawing the blanket up to her chest as her eyes lifted to the ceiling, a flicker of fear emerging in them. Try to eat some more. She lowered her gaze to the thermos and the bowl she had taken barely 2 mouthfuls from.
Why? What do you really care?
That resignation was back in her voice, and he hated it. He cursed his brothers. She had been doing fine before they had returned, had been growing more comfortable around him. Now she was drifting away again, closing herself off to him, because she feared his brothers would hurt her, and that he would side with them. If it came down to it, what would he do? He pondered that as he walked to the door of the cell, as he opened it and focused on Katerina and his brothers, torn between them. He closed the door because any delay would see Karis coming down to confront her now, and he wanted her stronger before that happened. Marek lingered, his hand on the bolt as he finished sliding it into place, and looked in at Katerina, meeting her gaze, wanting her back with him and needing her to know that she wasn't alone. Whatever went down, he would be on her side. So he put it all out there and refused to regret it, no matter what happened. I care. Seeing you like this is killing me. Chapter 23. The moment Megan's black sneakers hit the wooden floor, she swallowed hard and breathed slowly, struggling to keep down the bile that shot into her throat. The wood-paneled kitchen whirled around her, cabinets blurring together as she struggled to focus. Sweetheart. Aries rubbed her lower back as she leaned forwards and braced her hands against her knees.
I'm fine.
She shook her head and managed to smile for him, but it didn't lift the concern from his dark eyes as he frowned down at her. She gave him a thumbs up.
Just peachy.
He didn't look as if he believed that, and she couldn't blame him. She had been doing her best over the last month, trying to keep up with everything that had happened, and keep everything between them as it had been, but it was hard. Impossible. There was too much swirling around her mind, 1,000 thoughts and fears that kept her awake while Aries slept beside her, had her tossing and turning and distant from him. She wasn't sure how she had thought she could keep her worries from him until she had figured everything out. He had been able to see right through her to her heart from the moment they had met, had the ability to strip away her layers to reveal the things she wanted to hide from him. He stroked her back and leaned forwards as she straightened, his focus wholly on her, as if his brothers didn't exist as Marek appeared in the kitchen doorway and everyone began talking. She squirmed under Aries' scrutiny, guilt churning her stomach worse than the teleport had as she wrestled with herself, hating keeping things from him. He was her partner, her husband, her everything. She shouldn't have any secrets from him. She didn't want to pretend everything was peachy when it wasn't. It felt as if her whole world was falling apart around her, and she hated herself for trying to cope with it alone, when she knew Aries would be there for her, would be the strength she needed right now, and would see her through it all. Pressure built inside her as she struggled to find the words, had her tensing up in a way that Aries noticed. He lifted his hand to her face, his brow furrowing as his eyes leaped between hers. Heck, she just needed to say it. Why couldn't she say it? She just had to throw it out there, and Aries would see to it that all of her fears, all of her hurt and doubts became something else, something she wanted to feel. Happiness, excitement, joy. The pressure reached boiling point, and she couldn't hold it back as she looked into his eyes, as she saw the worry in them, the unconditional love.
I'm late,
she blurted. Everyone felt quiet, the air in the room thickening until she wasn't sure she could breathe as she waited for the bomb to drop. Silly, Aries grinned, one that melted her heart. We're perfectly on time. Valen was last in. You worry about the strangest things, sweetheart.
No, I'm late.
His expression gradually changed from innocent confusion to shock, his eyes widening as his eyebrows rose high on his forehead and his lips parted. Late? He stared at her, paling by degrees. She nodded, hyper-aware of the other 6 men in the room as they gaped at her. Baby late. She twisted her fingers together in front of her blue jeans and pulled a face.
Yes.
She was sure of that at least, had taken what felt like 3,000 tests over the last few weeks. The verdict had always remained the same. Pregnant. Her man finally smiled, cracking a grin that was accompanied by a strained laugh, and she melted as tears formed in his eyes. Eyes that shone with love so deep, she felt as if she might drown in it. His hand shook against her face, and she smiled as tears filled her eyes now, seeing Aries so overwhelmed by her news touching her deeply, chasing away some of the fears that had plagued her. I'm going to have a son. He looked from her to his brothers, his grin holding even as he was paling further. She laughed too, a short bark that seemed so out of place in the moment, but it seemed her body wasn't quite sure how to react to the whole situation.
It could be a daughter, you know. There are 2 sexes.
Aries just continued to grin at his brothers. Who'd have thought one of us would be a dad before we were 1,000? Her stomach dropped, the smile falling from her face as one of her deepest fears loomed before her.
I don't even want to think about the complications involved in this.
Ares tossed her a confused look.
I'm mortal.
She waved her hand up and down Ares from his heavy boots up his black jeans to the t-shirt that stretched like a second skin over his chest.
You're a god. You live for thousands of years.
And so can you. Karis interjected, and she looked across the kitchen island at him. With regular visits to the underworld, you will gradually become like us. We are a product of our environment as well as our breeding. Time in the underworld will change you. Your aging will slow. The same will happen to your child. In the mortal world, you will age faster, but not noticeably so. Ares slung his arm around her shoulder and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. It'll work out, sweetheart. When I told you I wanted forever with you, I meant it. She twisted and looked up at him, blamed her hormones when tears spilled onto her cheeks and warmth filled her. She had never seen him looking so proud, so happy. She had been afraid he wouldn't want the child or that something would prevent her from having it, some sort of incompatibility between them. But the way he was looking at her said all of her fears had been for nothing. I'll send a message to my parents right away. He smoothed another kiss across her brow. They'll want to know. Another wave of fear swept over her, this one with the force of a tsunami, and she stared blankly at Ares' chest as she reeled from it.
This is all suddenly a little too real.
Her ears rang and she lowered her hand to her stomach, not hearing anything as she thought about everything. Not only was she pregnant, but she was carrying the child of a god, and the grandparents were the god king of the underworld and his wife Persephone, a goddess of nature. She wasn't bringing a baby into the world. She was bringing a demigod into it. Breathe. Ares' voice broke through the ringing, and she stared at him as he leaned over in front of her, bringing his eyes level with hers. His handsome face softened, love and concern in his eyes that called to her and told her to trust him, to believe in him as she always had. He would take care of her and the baby. He slowly smiled, threatening to send the tears in his eyes dashing down his cheeks. It's going to be great. You'll see. I'll be the best damned husband and dad the world has ever seen. She nodded, couldn't stop herself from throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him. He banded his arms around her, clutching her close, and kissed her deeply, pouring love into it that chased the fears away. She leaned into his kiss as he lifted her, as he cradled her gently, tucking one hand beneath her backside to support her. When he finally broke away from her lips, he looked down and pressed a hand to her stomach, pride shining in his dark eyes as they glittered with sparks of gold and red. The heat of his hand seeped into her t-shirt, a gentle warmth that made her feel loved as he kept control of his fire, holding it under his command so he wouldn't hurt her. Congratulations, Karis murmured. The heat bloomed on her cheeks as Megan remembered that they weren't alone. She looked at the men gathered before her, taking in the range of their expressions everything from happiness to shock. Ares sobered as he looked at Marek where he stood near the door, his wild dark hair a mess of waves that looked as if he had been running his fingers through it all night. Megan sobered too, cursed herself as she looked at him, into his tired brown eyes. His handsome face was somber even as he smiled, and she could see he was forcing himself to be happy for them. This wasn't the time to be celebrating anything.
I'm sorry,
she said, and he waved her away, but she refused to hold her tongue and let him have his way.
I didn't mean for it to come out like this. Now, I should have waited a little longer.
Because Marek had the weight of the world on his shoulders and he didn't need her adding more to it. Escher suddenly spoke. A babe? He stared at her stomach, his blue eyes rapidly darkening, turning stormy as they narrowed and his black eyebrows met hard above them. His hands shook as he curled them into fists at his sides, arms trembling beneath the long sleeves of his black shirt he wore over a gray marl t-shirt. The water that had been dripping into the sink behind him suddenly slowed, drawing her focus there as a perfect orb of it hung in the air. Escher? Diamond went to him, and Ares lowered Megan to her feet and moved in front of her, which seemed to be the entirely wrong move to make. Escher growled and moved left, trying to see past Ares. We have to keep her out of sight. Escher snarled and took a hard step towards her before casting a panicked glance around the room at his brothers. The enemy cannot know she is pregnant. We have to take her from this place. From that vile abomination in the cells. Watch your tongue, brother. Marek's voice was darker than she had ever heard it, the fury that laced each word managing to draw her focus from Escher as Karis went to him and gently clutched his shoulder to keep him in place. What happened to Katerina wasn't her fault. It was mine. But the babe, Escher started, black ringing his irises as he threw a worried glance at Ares. I will keep Megan safe. Ares cut him off, his deep voice gentle and low, and she appreciated his attempt to ease Escher's mood and his mind. It had become apparent to her over the last month or two that Escher had come to view her as family, and that meant the protective side of him that needed to know his family were safe now extended to her, and also to Eva and Aiko. Escher's family was growing, and Ares had warned her that it meant the chances of him losing himself to his other side was growing with it. And now she had announced that she was bringing a baby into his family. She could see in his eyes that it was too much for him as he looked between Diamond and Ares and her. He was thinking bad things, dwelling on the negatives just as she had been. Megan stepped out from behind Ares so Escher could see her and could see that she was fine. She slipped her hand into Ares' right one and Escher looked there.
Nothing will happen to me,
Megan said softly, hoping to calm him.
Ares will take care of me.
We all will. Ares looked at each of his brothers in turn. We'll all keep Megan safe. Everyone nodded, except Diamond. He had backed off into the corner of the kitchen, his pale blue eyes cold and distant as he stared at her in a way that chilled her and left her feeling something was wrong with him. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. She lowered her hand to her stomach and tried to focus on the conversation as it flowed around her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Diamond, even when he smiled and his eyes brightened, whatever had been bothering him seemingly forgotten as he congratulated her and Ares. Was it because he shared Ares' problem and was unable to touch anyone because his power had manifested when he had come to this world? Now Ares not only had her, someone he could touch without fear of harming them, but they had a child on the way. Was that the reason Diamond had looked so cold and distant? Or was there something else that haunted him? Chapter 24. Marek kept a close eye on Escher as the meeting moved from waves of congratulating Megan and Ares and discussing what would happen for both of them now, to discussing Katerina and their enemy. Escher's eyes had darkened again the moment someone had mentioned her. Marek was damned if he would let his brother get nearer. He couldn't teleport right now, but he was still strong enough to take Escher down if he needed to do it. Or at least he hoped he was. Karis, can we discuss this while you do something for me? Marek pulled his t-shirt off, earning a growl from Ares that his big brother apologized for with a sheepish smile when Marek glared at him. He wouldn't hold it against his brother. If Ares whipped his top off in front of Katerina, if any of his brothers revealed their bodies to her, he would react in the same way, the possessive dark side of his blood filling him with a need to drive them away from his female. Karis nodded, his green eyes grave as he moved around the kitchen. This will hurt. Marek pulled one of the stools from beneath the counter on the island and settled himself on it. He rested his elbows on the dark marble top and tried to focus on what he had learned from Katerina as Karis came to stand behind him. The second Karis's palm made contact with his shoulder, fire blazed across his back and burrowed deep into his bones. Marek gritted his teeth and grunted as he dug his fingers into the marble, a vain attempt to brace himself against the pain spreading through his body. Megan gave him a concerned look. He scowled at her, gaining a black look from Ares. He didn't need anyone coddling him. Are we dealing with the thing in the basement? Escher bit out. Marek bared teeth at him. No one touches Katerina. I have her talking. He grunted when another searing wave crashed over him, and he felt as if his bones might burn to cinders. This is impressive work. Karis shifted his hand, tracing fingertips that burned like acid over the mark. Is it right to be impressed by something a demon did? Callistos voiced what was clearly on everyone's mind, judging by the way they all looked at Karis as if he had gone crazy. I've never seen a ward created by a demon before, and it did entirely shut down Marek's powers. When Karis put it like that, Marek was a little bit impressed too. The Wraith had skills, powers that they hadn't known about before or even thought possible for a demon to possess. I think it comes from his power to steal memories. Marek leaned forwards, obeying Karis as he nudged his shoulder. The burning started again, but this time a tugging accompanied it, a weird sensation that made him feel as if Karis was trying to physically pull something from him, and that something didn't want to leave. Stands to reason. He took Escher's memories and now yours. He has pieces of your knowledge, enough to cobble together a ward. Ares leaned towards Marek and peered at his shoulder, his eyebrows rising as he tried to get a look at the mark. This is more than cobbled together, Karis countered, and the tugging sensation grew fiercer, until Marek couldn't stop his shoulder from lifting with it. This runs deep. A ward like this takes skill. He deciphered how to do this from whatever memories he managed to take from you two. That takes intelligence. So the Wraith is the Marek of the enemy? Callistos hopped up to sit on the counter on the other side of the island to Marek and opened a cylindrical packet. He tossed one of the cookies in his mouth and pulled a thoughtful face as he ate it. Valen reached over and swiped one for himself. What else do you think he knows? Marek had a suspicion that the Wraith knew a lot more than he was letting on, things that could prove vital to their enemy in the battle ahead. He knows enough. He was able to break our wards to take the illusionist back, and that makes him a threat. Karis tracked one of the lines on Marek's back, and the whole thing lit up, ripping a pained snarl from Marek's lips as white-hot fire lanced him, and he doubled over, breathing hard. His vision wobbled, lights winking across it as he fought for air, to shut down the pain ricocheting through his bones. All done. Karis patted him on the back. Lizabeta, Marek murmured, his mouth and brain still fixed on what he had been about to say before Karis had attempted to kill him. I thought her name was Katerina, Callistos said. Marek swallowed hard. Lizabeta, the illusionist. Katerina called her that. We have a name at last, then. Think it might be of use? Ares didn't sound sure, and Marek wasn't either. A name was nothing to go on. He had pored over the knowledge in their servers when the illusionist had first made an appearance, and he had no records of one of her kind. Did you see her when you were being held captive? Karis edged into view, his green eyes still sober, revealing nothing. Marek nodded. I think all of this, it's revenge. He pushed up into a sitting position. At least what the Wraith did to me was. A ward to take your strength and powers. He wanted you to suffer like she did. Diamond cast a worried glance at his shoulder. Does it feel better now? Marek rolled it and focused on his body and slowly nodded as he felt his connection to the earth inside him, felt the strength flowing through his veins. Did anything happen while I was away? He hadn't had a chance to ask them when they had been at the castle before, because he had been too preoccupied with Katerina, was still preoccupied by her as his focus drifted to the wooden floor at his feet. She was down there, close to him. Was she able to hear what they were discussing? He hoped not, but some breeds of demon did have heightened senses, including hearing. Demon activity at the gates is increasing again. Karis casually folded his arms across his chest, causing the sleeves of his black shirt to tighten over his muscles. There have been several instances in the last 48 hours where we have encountered multiple demons near each gate, which, judging by the looks on his brothers' faces, was unnerving everyone. We have to face facts here, Ares put in as he drew Megan closer to him, curling his arm protectively around her shoulders to tuck her against his side. The other world is looking worse again. Demons are attempting the gates more than once a night, and I'm worried. I can't be the only one. Diamond and Escher nodded in unison. Callistos lowered a cookie from his lips. I don't like it. I preferred it when it was quiet in Rome, just the odd, stupid demon. Valen stole the cookie from Cal. Now I can't go a single night without killing double digits. Eva is helping as best she can, but it's only getting worse. How long before it's 10 demons at each attempt? 20? Marek hadn't realized things had gotten that bad in his absence. If all the demons hiding in the cities come crawling out of the woodwork, then we are going to be in trouble. Taking down a few demons is one thing, but an entire horde of them? They could use sheer numbers alone to overwhelm us. Ares stroked Megan's arm. They must be being drawn out by the activity of our enemy. They're gaining confidence. The demons I'm seeing are older, stronger. It won't be long before something goes down. I can feel it brewing." Marek wanted to mention that he sounded like the real god of war now, but held his tongue, aware that talking of Enyo's brother might end with Karis finally losing his temper again. "We will devise a plan," Karis said, and his gaze shifted from Ares to Marek. "Perhaps we can get some information from Katerina. She's awake. I left her eating, but she's weak. Whatever is happening to her, it's taking its toll physically and emotionally." He flicked a glance at Escher to check on his brother and found him glaring at the floorboards, murder in his eyes. "I can take you to see her, but she won't talk with this many of us around." It seemed like a valid excuse to get rid of some of his brothers, and he was glad when Karis nodded. "I want to take Megan home so I can get a messenger to relay the news to our parents." Ares shuddered, and he wasn't the only one. Valen and Callistos both joined him. "Creepy bastards," Valen muttered beneath his breath. "Always popping out of thin air." Marek couldn't agree with him more. While he and his brothers could teleport, there was something about the way a messenger did it that disturbed him. Their appearance didn't help. Messengers were all male and all shared the same appearance, as if they had been cloned. Their short black-blue hair and heterochromatic eyes, one green and one blue, and their defined features making it impossible to distinguish one from the other. One second you were alone, the next there was one of them right next to you. Their ability to know the exact location of whoever they were to contact was what made their teleporting so unnerving. And they had zero boundaries. One had even appeared while he had been in the shower once. "Plus, I have to get you home to rest." Ares swept Megan up into his arms, and she scowled at him, her dark eyes and soft features hardening as she huffed.
Don't get overbearing straight away.
She pouted and stroked his shoulders, working black magic on his brother, judging by how Ares instantly softened, the determination in his eyes morphing into something else.
Can't we just enjoy this?
Ares grinned. "I know a way we can celebrate." Diamond glowered. Callistos retched. Valen smirked. "Escher, return to Tokyo and cover it and Hong Kong." Karis was all business as usual as he crossed the room, passing Ares and Megan as they disappeared. "Cal, take care of London and Paris." "I'll cover Rome and Seville." Diamond stepped, leaving black swirls of smoke behind him. Cal and Escher both nodded and teleported too, leaving Marek and Valen with Karis. Marek could live with that. He relayed everything Katerina had told him to Karis, and everything that had happened, filling him in as Valen demolished the rest of the packet of cookies. When he had brought both of his brothers up to speed, he led the way down to Katerina's cell. He gripped the bolt, his pulse pounding faster as he looked at Karis and Valen, and grew aware of what was about to happen. This wasn't going to be easy, but he needed to let Karis near her, and he needed to let his brother do his thing. He had to stand by and watch without interfering, even if Katerina was hurting. Interrupting Karis and severing their connection would only cause her more pain. He pulled the bolt back and stepped into the room, and Katerina's gaze leaped from him to his brothers as they entered behind him. "Katerina, this is Valen and Karis. Karis is going to take a look at your memories." Marek stepped aside to let him pass. Katerina shot backwards, her spine hitting the stone wall as she clutched the blanket to her.
He's going to do what now?
He wanted to go to her as she stared wide-eyed at Karis and shook her head. Valen shoved him in the back, propelling him towards her. Marek focused on her rather than the urge to glare at his brother for intervening. He eased down to kneel beside her by Karis's feet. "We just need to see that everything you've told me is true. You don't have anything to worry about. I'll be right here." Marek resisted the desire to place his hand on the cot beside her, tempting her to take it, mostly because Karis was watching him, observing him closely. It struck him that hiding what he felt for Katerina was pointless. Karis would see it soon enough, through Katerina's eyes. He was jealous of his brother as he realized that Karis was about to find out exactly what her feelings for him were, how she felt whenever she looked at him, what she thought about him. He knew his brother wouldn't focus on such things, not when he was looking for the truth about their enemy and her involvement, but it still grated. Karis crouched in front of her, and she kept her eyes fixed on Marek, even when his brother spoke. "Katerina, I need you to look at me." She shook her head and squeezed her eyes shut. Marek lifted his hand and placed it over hers where it clutched her knee. It'll be fine, Katerina. Relax. If you relax, it won't hurt. You won't even notice it happening. If she didn't relax, it was going to hurt like hell, both her and him. Can you do this for me, Katerina? He squeezed her hand. Her eyes slowly opened and locked on him, and he didn't hide how much this meant to him, how badly he needed to know that she had been telling the truth about everything, that everything had been real.
What if he sees things I don't want him to see? My memories are private. I'd like to keep them that way.
She swallowed hard and looked as if she wanted to glance at his brother as her heart rate spiked in Marek's ears.
I don't want him prodding around in there, but I'm getting the feeling I don't get a choice.
He couldn't blame her for being nervous or upset. He didn't like the thought of Karis poking around his head, and he had been angry the few times his brother had done it without permission. You're right. Your memories are private. He caressed her hand, his eyes lowering to it, locking on his fingers as he stroked them along hers. And it's hard for me to ask you to do this, but I need you to do it, Katerina. I need to know everything is real. Her eyes leaped between his, and her features softened as understanding dawned in them, and then resolve bloomed in their hazel depths, and her fear faded. She shifted her hand beneath his, feathered her thumb along his fingers, and held his gaze, staring so deep into his eyes that he felt connected to her. She nodded, lingered for a few seconds, and then shifted her eyes to Karis. The moment she met Karis's gaze, she relaxed, her hands going lax beneath Marek's touch. Her lips parted and her eyes dulled, losing focus. Marek kept up with the pressure of his hand on hers, hoping she could feel that he was there with her still, even as she felt the presence of Karis in her mind. He was still here for her, and he wouldn't let anything happen to her. As the minutes trickled past, Valen started pacing, his boots loud on the stone floor. It did nothing to help Marek's nerves. He kept his focus on Katerina's face, on her eyes as she stared at his brother, her pupils gradually dilating until they devoured the earthy hazel of her irises. She slowly leaned forwards towards Karis, as if she was experiencing that same powerful pull Marek had when Karis had been removing the power of the ward carved on his shoulder. Marek bit back a growl when Katerina kept leaning forwards, her hand falling from beneath his to press against the bar of the cot as her legs fell open. She moved closer to Karis and then closer still, until their faces were only inches apart. Too damn close for comfort. Marek did growl when she leaned further forwards, looking for all the world as if she was about to kiss his damned brother. Karis eased back and Katerina blinked and looked herself over, a confused crinkle forming between her eyebrows before she quickly sank back against the wall. Marek glared at his brother. Karis toyed with the ring on his thumb, twisting the band around it, his handsome face etched in pensive lines as he stared at Katerina, his eyes shining like emeralds. He blinked, and when he opened them again, they were fixed on Marek and were dull again, back to their normal color. Marek braced himself, preparing for the worst, for all of his fears to come true in the next instant. She is telling the truth about everything. Those words rolled over Marek, and it took him a moment to realize his brother was telling him something positive, the complete opposite of what he had feared. Katerina muttered things in Catalan under her breath, calling his brother a devil, stating that he was the demon as she clawed at her dirty hair, pulling it back from her face. He wanted to go to her and comfort her, but Karis wasn't done. We can use her. Karis pushed to his feet. She is a valuable asset. She will be able to get us information. Marek shot to his feet as fire blazed through him, burning up his blood. No! Karis slowly turned to face him, a shadow passing over his features that had Katerina whispering a prayer, and had Marek regretting what he had said. He hadn't been able to stop himself. Katerina had been through enough. She proved that by falling on her side, her arms draped over the edge of the cot in a tangle. Marek eased down beside her and checked on her, his heart thundering in his ears as he made sure she was still breathing and had only passed out. I was not making a suggestion, Karis snarled, onyx invading the edges of his irises as he rose to his full height and glared down at Marek. I was making a decision. Marek had to be an idiot because he stared his brother down, unwilling to go along with that decision just because his brother had lost his temper again. She may be able to get us information about Calendria. Karras's features hardened, his eyes glittering like green diamonds as he narrowed them on Marek. The Wraith is the one handling her. She can get close to him. Marek burned with a need to know what had happened to their sister's soul, too, but at the risk of losing Katerina, he wasn't sure he could do it. There had to be another way. He clenched his fists and cursed himself for thinking that. Karras was right, and Katerina was their best option. She could get close to the demon. She could bring them information, and then once they had a solid lead, they could finally break everything to Callistos. He hated keeping their youngest brother in the dark about everything, but he knew deep in his heart that it was necessary until they knew exactly what had happened to her soul, and how they could find it again. If they told him now, it would only make things harder on him. He had succumbed to his affliction after he had been to the Twin Gate. How badly would he react if he discovered they knew what had happened to Calendria? Don't go along with it. Valen stepped into the room, dragging Marek's focus to him as light flickered from his direction. Tiny sparks of lightning chased around his fingers as he glared at Karras. It's a death sentence and you know it. Look at what happened to Eva when she went double agent for us. Marek's stomach turned. Eva had almost been killed. He looked between Karras and Valen, a war erupting inside him as he thought about asking Katerina to infiltrate the enemy. Benares and Jinn, the incubus and succubus siblings, had been dangerous enough, but the Wraith was even more dangerous and far more intelligent. He had proven that. They will know Katerina helped me escape, and that was the main reason he couldn't go through with it. Someone would have seen her. You said yourself that the illusionist saw you had been trying to break the ward, and that she had brought Katerina to you more than once. It is possible she will believe you broke the ward and took Katerina hostage when she tried to come to you. Karras sounded less than sure about that, which was not a comfort. I can go back, alone. I teleported out of that house. I can get back in. Marek glanced down at Katerina where she lay on the cot, out cold. I can draw him out or something. Or something was far from a solid plan. It wasn't like him to want to rush in like this, but the alternative was Karras getting his way and sending Katerina in. He couldn't let that happen, so he would come up with a plan on the fly for once. No careful preparation, no pulling up of blueprints and scouting the location, studying every aspect of it. He would just pull a Valen or an Ares and make it up as he went. The look on Valen's face said he knew what Marek was thinking, and that he wouldn't be alone if he did decide to go with the flow for once. The Wraith will be on his guard now. He won't easily be drawn out, Marek. Karras's deep voice was smooth, one of reason. Marek had always admired the level head his brother had on his shoulders. Now he hated it. So Katerina will be in even more danger if we just send her in there. Marek paced away from her, unable to keep still any longer. I can't do it. The Wraith will know she helped me. Even if by some miracle he doesn't, how are we going to convince him that I took her captive? How exactly is her escape going to look real? Valid points. Valen looked from him to Karras. Got a counterpoint? A soft voice croaked behind Marek.
I'll do it.
Chapter 25. Katerina was aware that she had passed out at some point. She rested on her side, the sound of male voices filling her ears as she drifted, thoughts spinning into a blur. What had Karras seen? Enough to clear her name, apparently. She remembered that much from before she had passed out. The talking grew louder, more like arguing. She tuned into them until the spinning in her head slowed enough that she could make out what they were talking about. Her. She listened harder. Something about using her to infiltrate the enemy just as the enemy had wanted her to infiltrate the brothers. Karras was for it, Valen was against it, and Marek? Vehemently against it. So Katerina will be in even more danger if we just send her in there, Marek snarled, warming her heart and chasing the chill of having her mind read from her skin. I can't do it. The Wraith will know she helped me. Even if by some miracle he doesn't, how are we going to convince him that I took her captive? How exactly is her escape going to look real? Valid points. Valen paused. Got a counterpoint? Katerina thought about everything she had done, about Guillaume and what was happening to her. She didn't have much hope left, and her body was unreliable, and there was a high chance Marek was right, and the wraith he spoke of would kill her. But if she could help Marek, she would do it.
I'll do it,
She croaked and pushed herself up. The room wobbled into a dark blur as she squeezed her eyes shut. When she opened them again, Marek was beside her, holding her shoulders and helping her sit up. No. He brushed his thumbs over her skin, his touch offering comfort that she stole and savored. She looked at him, catching the horror and fury in his dark eyes. Fury he turned on Karis. She isn't doing it.
I'm doing it.
She lifted her hand and placed it over his right one where it gripped her arm.
I can do it.
You'll need to make it look convincing, Valen said, earning a glare from Marek that held disappointment. Because Valen was switching sides? His violet-haired brother shrugged it off. I'm just saying, it's going to take a public fight to convince the enemy that she was a prisoner, not a guest. And it's the only way of making her escape look real. I said no. Marek frowned at all of them when Karis continued as if he hadn't spoken. It cannot be one of us, then. The enemy would know we are pulling our punches.
I can handle myself, although I do feel a little weird and weak,
she put in, tired of them not including her when she was the one who would be heading into enemy territory. She frowned. When had the Wraith and Lizabeta become their enemy? The answer to that question stoked the fire in her blood into an inferno and made her restless to get going. When they had pulled her into this and threatened her brother. What makes you think you can handle fighting a god? Valen arched an eyebrow at her.
I hunt vampires. It's how I met Marek.
She looked up at Marek. He went remarkably still as both of his brothers looked at him. She cursed. His vampire hunting was meant to be a secret. It is not as if I did not see it. Among other things we will be discussing in private before the day is over. Karis slid a look at her and she glared at him. Because he had seen in her memories the time Marek had spent with her in this cell, and now he knew Marek's secret, one he had guarded and entrusted to her. Marek looked less than pleased at the prospect of having to talk to Karis about what his brother had seen. I still think it's a shit idea to have one of us fighting her. Valen sounded a lot like he was trying to shift the focus away from Marek and his troubled past in an attempt to make Karis forget about it. At least Katerina thought it had been an attempt at helping Marek. She couldn't be sure, because all it did was anger Marek. No one is touching Katerina, Marek snarled, the vicious sound startling her. She looked at him and a shadow crossed his features, blackening them as his eyes turned onyx. No one lays a damned finger on her. Valen jerked his chin towards her. You're laying fingers on her right now. The joke was lost on his brother. Marek shot to his feet, seized Valen by his throat, and slammed his back into the wall beside the door, every muscle in his arms straining and bulging as he tightened his grip. While Valen was slimmer than Marek, his muscles less pronounced, Katerina wasn't confident Marek would win in a fight. Something about Valen left her feeling he was the sort of man who fought dirty. Valen just smiled. There was something seriously wrong with him. He frightened her more than Karis did when he smiled like that, as if he was enjoying what was happening to him. She reevaluated her opinion of him when Marek suddenly jerked and shuddered and sparks leaped from around Valen's hand where it touched his wrist. He didn't just frighten her. Valen positively terrified her. He could somehow channel electricity. Marek released him and staggered backwards, shaking his head at the same time. Calm your tits. Valen shoved away from the wall and shook his hand at his side until the sparks leaping between his fingers had all disappeared. None of us will touch her. We can have Eva do it. The enemy knows she's on our side now and she's human, so it would appear authentic. I still don't like the sound of this, Marek grumbled and rubbed his arm. It appears it is happening whether you like it or not. Karis adjusted the ring on his thumb, a silver one that resembled a wedding band. We will discuss it later, once you and Katerina have had time to rest. When was the last time you slept? Marek shrugged. Does passing out count? Her gut squirmed as an image of him doing just that flashed across her mind. Watching him go down in that street outside the bar had utterly destroyed her. She had somehow forced herself to remain where she had been, resisting the need to go to him and check on him, aware that if she revealed her feelings for him that the Wraith would hurt her too. Every time Lisabeta had brought her to Marek and she had seen the state of him, the fear that they would hurt her had compounded, and the guilt had grown stronger. She wasn't aware that Karis and Valen had left and she was alone with Marek until he came and crouched before her, drawing her out of the past, plunging her back into the present. Helping Marek and making amends wasn't the only reason she wanted to become a double agent, as Valen had called it. Now that the demon fever had lost its grip on her and she was thinking more clearly, she knew that the Wraith had her brother, and that was why Marek's brother hadn't been able to find him. Guillaume had been leverage before, and now he would be leverage again. The Wraith would use him to lure her out and force her to do as he wanted. But she wouldn't. Not anymore. "You don't have to do this," Marek husked, his voice going low as he reached up and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear.
"I do."
She stared deep into his eyes that held warmth, and something she dared to hope was real, because it echoed inside her too, even when she knew it was hopeless. There wasn't any way to save herself. She could see that now. But she could still save her brother, and she could save Marek. Because she cared about him. More than cared. She had fallen in love with him, and he would never know. Because whatever happened next, he could never truly love her. Not now that she was a demon. But she was still going to do this for him. "I'm sorry about everything." He stared at his fingers as he brushed them down her cheek. "All of this happened to you because of me, and I'm sorry. It would have been better if you had never met me." She didn't understand how he could think that, or believe that he really meant it. If she'd had her way, things would have been different, but she couldn't bring herself to wish they had never met. She was glad that she had met him that night, that for a brief, beautiful moment her crappy life had been wonderful. She had met a man who could understand her, who had been more than attracted to her, and who she had fallen in love with.
"I'm not sorry,"
she whispered, her voice lacking the strength and conviction she felt in her heart. She shuffled to the edge of the cot, and he moved backwards to give her room, his eyes darting between hers as he frowned.
"I'm not sorry we met."
She lifted both of her hands and framed his face, relished the warmth of his golden skin beneath her palms, and how he looked at her with all the love in the world in his eyes, tinged with confusion and a lot of pain.
"I'm only sorry that things didn't turn out the way I wanted."
She tried to smile, but it wobbled on her lips as she looked into his eyes, as she tried not to think about tomorrow or what was to come, or what would happen if she somehow survived. Because there was no hope. She had thought life was cruel to her, but she had been mistaken. Her parents' deaths, her brother's turning, a decade spent desperately trying to save him. It had only been the warm-up act. It had only been the build-up to this. Life hadn't been her main enemy. Love was. Love was crueler, filled her with despair and pain, and yet she couldn't stop it from pouring through her whenever she looked at Marek. Couldn't stop it any more than she could stop her own heart from beating, even when it was hopeless. Marek cupped her cheeks in his palms, his gaze searing her, filled with the conflict and hurt running rampant inside her, revealing that he didn't know what to do either. He opened his mouth, his brow furrowed, and he shook his head and pulled her into a hug that was so tight she wanted to cry. She cursed the world instead. She cursed it with all the venom she could muster. Because the one thing she wanted was right here in her arms, but he would never be hers. The world spun into a cold darkness. Chapter 26. When the darkness faded, Katerina pulled away from Marek and looked around her, curious as to where he had taken her. A colossal black building that resembled a temple from ancient Greece towered before her, thick, towering fluted columns lining the facade to support the triangular pediment. There were 2 rows of them at the front, but only a single row along the sides, forming a walkway that ran around the temple. Beyond it, a low-roofed walkway lined with columns connected it on either side to smaller temples that were set back from the main one. Beyond them, the blackest mountains she had ever seen speared a dull gray sky, fault lines in their cragged faces glowing gold and illuminating the smoky clouds that swirled across them.
"Marek!"
She seized his arm, her heart racing and lodging in her throat, as cold realization slid down her spine. This was the underworld. He had brought her to the underworld, a place where demons weren't allowed. Why? 1,000 doubts filled her head, fear gripping her tightly as she let them come, didn't have the strength to deny them while she was staring at the ominous black temple. The bright, colorful garden that surrounded it was so out of place, and did nothing to soften the terrifying image of the buildings. The whole place reeked of power, malevolence that seeped into her skin and made her want to teleport away. Only she didn't know how to teleport. She had managed it once by pure chance, and 100 attempts after that she still hadn't managed it again.
I don't like it here. Take me back.
She shook Marek's arm, jerking him back and forth as he stared at the entrance of the temple. I can't take us back. I didn't bring us here, he murmured, voice distant, as if he wasn't quite with her.
You can teleport. Just do it.
She squeezed his arm, digging her fingers into his biceps.
I said I would do what your brother wanted. I don't need to be convinced.
I'm not trying to convince you. He turned a frown on her and shook his head. And believe me, I would never bring you here, even if I could enter this realm. I was banished to Earth. I can't teleport to this realm until that banishment is lifted.
If you didn't bring us here, who did?
Her hand started to shake as she considered everything he had said and drew a terrible conclusion. Ice skated down her spine, a sensation that someone was watching her. That feeling of malevolence grew until it was choking, had her shaking Marek again, on the verge of begging him to try to teleport. She stilled, frozen right to her marrow as awareness washed over her. They weren't alone. She slowly inched her head to her left, towards the main temple as metal clanked against marble, the sound like a death knell in her ears.
Marek,
she whispered and stepped back, releasing him even as she wanted to edge closer to him instead. She didn't dare, not when her eyes landed on a tall, slender figure in the doorway of the temple, dwarfed by the height of it. Black shadows appeared around him, swirling with streaks of blue and deep red. Katerina wished with all of her heart that her flaky new powers hadn't chosen this moment to reveal emotions to her, because she had the dreadful feeling those were the colors of anger and hatred so deep nothing could alter it. The man strode into the light of one of the torches mounted on the columns at the front of the temple, and she swallowed hard. Warm light chased over the black armor that hugged the man's lean frame, and the spikes that rose from his short onyx hair. A heavy crimson cloak hung from his shoulders, swirling around his ankles with each step, drawing her eyes down to the pointed tips of his boots. They scraped on the marble with each step, and she couldn't stop herself from imagining how he might use them in battle. Although the claws that tipped his gauntlets were infinitely more terrifying. He tucked his arms behind his back, carrying himself with a regal poise, as he tilted his head up and narrowed red eyes on her. The colors surrounding him turned as black as the temple behind him, and then suddenly winked out of existence. Katerina wasn't sure whether to be relieved or worried by her newfound ability failing her again. She might have been able to use it as an early warning system, turning it to her advantage, although she doubted she would have a chance to escape if this man made a move. It would be over in a blink of his crimson eyes. If it wasn't for those eyes, she would say it was Karis who stood before her, dressed for war. She had the terrible feeling this man was a far cry from the one she had met in the cell, the one who had proposed to help them and had cleared her name with Marek. This man wanted her dead. It was right there in his eyes as he stared down his straight nose at her. "This is bad," Marek whispered beside her. She risked edging closer to him. The man's eyes narrowed, freezing her in place.
Who is that?
She really didn't want to know the answer to that because she already knew, and she wanted to keep pretending that this wasn't happening. "Father." Marek stood his ground when the man's eyes shifted to him. "The God King Hades." Oh, this was very bad. If Marek and his brothers hated demons, then this God King despised them with a vengeance. And he had summoned her, a demon. It was all going to end here. She had thought she had given up all hope, but some foolish part of her must have been clinging to a tattered thread of it, because now that she was facing death, she realized she had still believed she had a shot with Marek. And now whatever chance she might have had was going to die with her. Hades shifted his crimson eyes to her again, and his nostrils flared as he drew down a deep breath, as his black eyebrows knitted hard and his lips compressed. Disgust shone in those scarlet eyes, disgust and hatred, and violence. She instinctively brought her hands up to her chest, a vain attempt to shield the heart he could easily rip from her if he wanted it. She was no match for him. His power was palpable, thickening the air and pressing down on her. If he wanted her dead, she wouldn't stand a chance against him. Marek moved in front of her, placing himself between her and Hades. She stared at his back, reeling and struggling to believe what he had just done. He was shielding her, protecting her from her father. "You would do well to apologize for bringing this thing into my presence." The ground seemed to tremble in response to that deep voice rolling over the land, the tension in the air growing as each word left Hades' lips. "You brought her into your presence," Marek countered, and then his back stiffened, his shoulders going rigid, as if he regretted speaking out of turn to his father. Or maybe he was as afraid of him as Katerina was. No, she wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't going to let him scare her. Marek was right, and he had brought her to the underworld, and if her life was about to end, she was going to go down fighting, not cowering behind someone. She stepped to her left so she could see Hades, and clenched her fists as she stared him down. Because she was damned if he was going to talk about her as if she was something so far beneath him that she was akin to the dirt he scraped off his boot.
I didn't exactly choose to be infected by a demon.
Her hand shook as she spat those words. As she weathered the glare he turned on her, her heart thundered so fast that she felt sick as she fought to remain where she was and not slink behind Marek again. "I would never bring such a foul creature into my realm." Hades turned that glare on Marek. She could almost read Marek's mind as he frowned at his father, his handsome face awash with confusion that echoed in her. If Hades hadn't brought them to the underworld, who had?
"Do not treat our guests so poorly, darling."
A soft female voice came from behind Katerina, as gentle as a summer breeze, filled with warmth that was a strange contrast to the bleak lands around her. It evoked images of sunlight and greenery, of flowers and crystal-clear rivers. And Katerina swore the crimson in Hades' eyes faltered, a flicker of blue shining through as he looked beyond her to the woman. Marek looked over his shoulder, his face softening, his dark eyes gaining glimmers of gold and green as they tracked the woman. She came around Katerina's left, slowly drifting into view, and Katerina couldn't take her eyes off her. The long black dress she wore, layers of gauzy fabric that seemed to float as she moved with incredible grace, blended with the black earth, but her eyes were the clearest green and her hair was scarlet, flowing over her pale shoulders in gentle waves. "Mother," Marek whispered, the love in his eyes showing in his voice as he looked at the beautiful woman who didn't appear a year older than he was. She smiled serenely and held her hand out to him as she glided towards him, all elegance, a regal edge to her that was markedly different to the one Hades had. He was commanding, that of a king who expected absolute obedience and ruled with an iron fist. Hers was gentle, that of a queen who would do whatever was needed in order to ensure her people were cared for, were safe, and would live long lives filled with peace. A queen who loved all equally. Marek took her hand, bowed, and pressed a kiss to it, his eyes slipping shut as the waves of his dark hair fell forwards to caress his brow. He lingered, breathing her in, as if he couldn't bring himself to release her. If he wasn't allowed to enter this place, how long had it been since he had seen his parents? Katerina was always aware of the hole the death of her parents had left in her life, a void that would never be filled again. But she couldn't imagine what it would be like to be exiled from your home by your own parents, always aware they were alive but never allowed to see them. Marek finally, reluctantly released his mother's hand and stepped back, close to Katerina. "Why have you brought this thing here, Persephone?" The gentle way Hades said that didn't hide the hatred that seeped from him as he stared at Katerina. Persephone rounded Katerina, brushing Marek aside. He took another step back, and Katerina wanted to move, to close the distance between them again. While Persephone felt like light and warmth, Katerina was still deeply aware of the woman's incredible power, and the fact she was a demon in a world where she wasn't welcome. Assessing green eyes skipped over every inch of Katerina, and she swore she could feel them, was aware of them even when Persephone was behind her. What was she looking for? Had she brought Katerina here to simply sate her own curiosity? Or to judge her? Persephone glided back into view and stopped just in front of her. She reached a slender hand out towards her. "Stop!" Hades boomed, the sound cracking like thunder around them, shaking the black earth. Persephone froze, her fingers bare millimeters from Katerina's arm.
I am a goddess of creation and life,
Persephone said softly, as she slowly turned towards Hades.
I only wished to see if I could reverse what was done to this poor child.
Reverse it? Katerina didn't dare hope that was possible. Marek didn't believe it was, she knew that. He had spoken of finding a way, but there had been no shred of hope in his voice. Blue flickered in Hades' eyes again, concern surfacing in them as he gazed at his wife.
I will do this with or without your permission.
Persephone turned back to face Katerina. Hades huffed and scowled at her back. Very well. If you feel the slightest tainting of your powers, you are to release the creature. She nodded regally.
Of course, my love.
The look in her green eyes as she held Katerina's gaze said she had no intention of obeying that order. Katerina glanced at Marek. He didn't look at all surprised that his mother was willing to disobey his father. Was she so assured of her power over him? Katerina looked beyond the crimson-haired beauty to the towering god-king, and caught the love and concern in his blue eyes as he gazed at Persephone before he noticed Katerina staring. His irises blazed scarlet. He bared his fangs at her.
It is not wise to test him,
said the woman who was doing just that, her soft voice like a melody as it embraced Katerina, chasing some of the chill from her skin that Hades had caused by glaring at her. Her secret smile stole Katerina's heart and made her miss her mother all the more. She whispered,
Although it is fun sometimes.
Fun for you. Marek edged towards them, closing ranks with Katerina as he warily watched Hades. Persephone shrugged.
Your father will not lay a hand on her.
I'll believe that when I see it. What are you talking about over there? Hades growled. Persephone smiled over her shoulder at him.
Come down from there and find out for yourself.
He sneered at Katerina, making it painfully clear he had no intention of getting anywhere near her, which was oddly reassuring, until she considered that he probably didn't have to get anywhere near her to kill her.
This will not hurt.
Persephone gently laid her hand on Katerina's forearm. She steeled herself because Charis digging around in her mind had hurt, and she was sure that someone digging around in her body would be even more painful. Only Persephone's touch was warm, gentle, and Katerina felt strength flowing into her, heat and light that pushed out the vile darkness she had been aware of from the moment the wraith had injected her with the demon blood. Her stomach turned. That blood writhed in her veins, as if it feared Persephone. Persephone stroked her hand upwards, and the darkness swirled within Katerina, clearing her left side and pooling in her right leg, causing it to ache and burn. Sweat broke out on her brow and slid down her spine, and her vision wobbled as the ground pitched beneath her. She swayed towards Marek. He caught her right arm and held her. That's enough. Persephone released her. Marek checked Katerina over, beautiful concern in his eyes as he palmed her arm and pressed his other hand to her forehead. Are you all right? She swallowed and nodded as the darkness washed through her again, spreading out, and the fierce heat that had been building in her right leg abated, leaving her feeling as normal as she got these days. She looked to Persephone, afraid to hear the verdict but needing to know.
What has been done to you can be reversed,
Persephone said, those words chasing the cold from Katerina's heart, restoring fragments of her hope.
You simply need to find a healer, which is lucky for you.
She smiled, the sort of smile someone used when they made a joke. Katerina didn't get it. A healer? Where was she meant to find a healer? Megan. Katerina looked at Marek. He stared into the distance, hope flaring in his eyes that quickly died as he shifted them to land on her. Ares would never allow it.
Why not?
Persephone beat Katerina to asking that question.
He has allowed Megan to heal others. Why not this mortal? She cannot infect Megan.
but she was a demon. Katerina's shoulders sagged. She didn't want to, but she could understand why Ares would be reluctant to let Megan near her. Ares had come across as a tough son of a bitch when she had met him, one who fiercely protected those he loved. He had demanded she tell him what she wanted with Marek, why she was targeting him. He had been convinced that she had still been out to hurt his brother, which meant he would never let her near the woman he loved. Ares is determined to keep Megan safe. He practically made it a vow when we discovered she's pregnant. The last word to leave Marek's lips fell heavily, ratcheting up the tension in the air. Thick silence followed, and then Persephone's green eyes shot wide. Pregnant? Marek's own eyes widened and he cursed. You haven't had a messenger come? His mother shook her head. Another curse peeled from his lips. Then forget I said that. I said nothing. It was a mistake. It was too late. Persephone turned away from Katerina, revealing Hades where he now stood closer to them, his eyes completely blue and filled with surprise. We are going to be grandparents? Persephone turned back to Marek. Marek shoved his fingers through his wild brown hair, grimaced, and then his shoulders sank. He nodded. A baby. Persephone smiled at Hades, her emerald eyes glittering with unshed tears. Our son is having a baby. Megan is having the baby, Marek muttered. Persephone dismissed him with a wave of her slender hand and then paused and looked at Katerina. Speak to Megan anyway. Healing a mortal will be easy for her compared with healing a god. Marek nodded, and that flicker of hope ignited in his eyes again, sparking it to life inside her. His mother grinned at Hades, sending the tears tumbling down her cheeks. A baby. She laced her fingers together and brought her hands to her lips, her happiness shining in her eyes, seemingly infectious as the corners of Hades' lips curled into the semblance of a smile, and his blue eyes shone with something akin to love as he looked at her. Oh, a baby. I want to build a nursery. She beamed at Hades. He sighed. Ares has his own house now. She frowned, and the earth around her feet sprouted thorny brambles. But I want the baby to live here. They can have the east wing. It is quiet there, and I can visit. If you have your way, you will be raising this child. I know that look in your eyes, my love. But... She hurried to him, and he held his hands out to her, looked down into her eyes as she slipped her hands into his, and he curled his claws over them, holding them gently. A baby. There was a slight pout to her lower lip, and apparently that was all it took to strip Hades of his power. He raised his hand and cupped her cheek, smoothed his thumb across it, and looked at her with so much love in his eyes that Katerina looked away, because she felt as if she was prying. I know you long for another, he murmured low. But we talked about this. I cannot bear to see you hurt. When we lost her, it almost destroyed you. It destroyed me. Katerina's gaze drifted back to them. They had lost a child? It was there in Persephone's eyes as the happiness turned to fear and the brambles spread, becoming thick twisted branches as they encircled her. Hades' brow furrowed as he cupped both of her cheeks in his palms. His face tilted towards her, and his eyes shifted to red. I swear, my love, nothing will happen to this child. We will keep him safe. Hades' voice darkened, dropping low to scrape over gravel as the ground shook beneath Katerina's feet. Nothing will happen to any child brought into our family. I failed once. I will not fail again. Persephone nodded, and he wrapped his arms around her, lowered his head, and closed his eyes as he kissed her crimson hair. What had happened to a child of theirs? She looked at Marek. Tears laced his eyelashes as he looked at his parents, pain glittering in his eyes that told her the loss of that child had hurt everyone in their family. Marek glanced at her out of the corner of his eye and swallowed hard, brushed the back of his hand across his nose, and then scrubbed his neck. She wanted to ask him about the sibling he had lost, but she couldn't find her voice, and right now didn't seem like the appropriate time. She didn't want to cause Persephone more pain. It was clear that she still felt the loss keenly, and Katerina felt sorry for her. She had been so happy when she had found out she was going to have a grandchild, But that happiness had turned to cold fear in the space of barely a minute. She should be excited about this time, enjoying every step of it, not fearing it. Katerina looked at Hades and then Marek. Persephone wasn't alone in her fears. Hades and Marek both wore the same look, determination to keep that vow Ares had made and keep Megan and the baby safe, and fear they would fail at that task. She could understand why. Their enemy would make Megan a priority target if they discovered her pregnancy. Katerina wouldn't let it happen. She turned to Marek, more eager than ever to help him, and in turn his family. He held his hand out to her and she placed hers into it, warmth curling through her when he closed his fingers over hers and held it tightly. "We should go." He looked at his parents. Persephone emerged from Hades' arms and smiled despite her tears, aiming it at Katerina.
Be careful.
A trail of purest white tulips sprouted in a wave towards Katerina and bloomed around her feet, and Katerina looked down at them, afraid she would crush the delicate blooms. She looked to Marek for an explanation. "Apparently white tulips are your flower." He bent and plucked one and offered it to her. "Mother is a goddess of nature. We each have a flower."
What's yours?
She kept still as he tucked the bloom behind her ear. "That's a secret." He smiled. "Maybe you'll find out one day." She looked at the black earth, hoping the flower would blossom from it and reveal it to her, but apparently Persephone wasn't on her side and wanted her to find it out from Marek. "Relay a message to Ares," Hades said. "I wish to speak with him." Marek nodded. Hades slid her a look, not a disgusted one as she expected, but one that stayed with her as darkness swirled around her and Marek pulled her into his embrace, tucking her against him. His father had almost looked hopeful, and she had the feeling that if Megan could reverse what had been done to her, that he would welcome Katerina into his family. She looked up into Marek's eyes as they appeared back in the cell, seeing the hope that blossomed inside her reflected in them. She could save her brother. She could become human again. And then she could have the thing her heart wanted most of all, a life with Marek. Chapter 27. Marek wasn't alone with Katerina. He looked over her head to Karis where he stood in the doorway of the cell, Valen just behind him. "Where did you take her?" Karis stepped into the room, a shadow flitting across his face as he stared Marek down, leaving him in no doubt of his brother's anger, because he thought he had tried to take Katerina away from them to stop her from carrying out the mission Karis wanted her to take on. "Nowhere." Marek slowly released her and checked her over again, all of the fear that had been building inside him, the tension that had brought him close to snapping more than once, flooding from him as he saw she was fine, and she had come out of the meeting with his parents unscathed. "Mother summoned us so she could take a look at Katerina." Karis just stared at him. Valen whistled low. "Well, shit. Was Dad there?" Marek nodded. Karis and Valen exchanged a look, one that echoed the shock that still flowed through Marek, because he had honestly expected Hades to kill her. "How'd he take it?" Valen looked at Katerina, as if Marek needed a clue to know what he was really asking. How had Hades handled a demon in his domain? "Mother talked him down." As Marek's fear gave way, anger filled the space it left inside him. "She could have just come here to see her. It's summer." Which meant Persephone could leave his father's side without causing the seasons to spin out of control. "She wanted Dad to see her." Valen leaned against the doorframe. "Why?" Marek looked at him and he shrugged. "Maybe she wanted him to see Katerina wasn't the enemy. Maybe she wanted him to see how you feel about her. I don't know. Mom works in mysterious ways." He really hadn't needed Valen bringing up his feelings, not in front of Katerina. He could feel her looking at him now, studying his profile as he diligently kept it towards her. If he looked at her, she would see that Valen was right, and he had feelings for her. Deep ones. The sort that made a man do crazy things. Like shielding her from a god king who could obliterate him. Hades didn't need anyone pushing his buttons, not since Escher had breached the underworld to save Aiko and had ended up fighting him, and had come close to getting himself killed in the process. "She's meddling." Valen scuffed the stone floor with his boot and muttered, "Told you about meddling." He was right. Persephone was meddling. She was always aware of them, more so than Hades was. She knew their innermost feelings. She knew when they were in turmoil. And she always tried to make things better for them. She must have felt Marek's confusion and conflict and his love for Katerina, and his desperate need to save her and how he had lost hope. Not because he feared Katerina couldn't be cured, but because he feared his family would exile him and turn on him when they discovered what had dawned on him. If Katerina became a demon, he would still choose to be with her. So Persephone had summoned him, not only to see if she could find a way to cure Katerina for him, but because she had wanted Hades to see him with her. She had wanted his father to see that he loved Katerina and nothing would change that. At least he let you leave. Valen pushed away from the wall. Which is good. It means our plan can go ahead. Karis's green eyes held a subtle note of concern as he looked at Katerina.
I'm ready.
She straightened to her full height and tipped her chin up.
I can do this.
Marek looked at her. What Mother said about Megan being able to reverse what's happening to you. I want to take you to her now.
But you can't.
She smiled softly, understanding in her eyes.
I know. For this to work, I have to be the same as when I left.
I worry he would be able to sense the difference in you. He lifted his hand and stroked her right arm, aching with a need to go against what he had just said and take her to Megan. I don't want you to do this. She raised her hand and placed it over his, cupping it to her shoulder over her t-shirt.
I want to do it. I might be able to see my brother. I might be able to get him away from them.
Hope flared in her eyes, and he was glad to see it after how resigned she had been, her hazel gaze dull and somber. Are you sure you're strong enough? He looked her over, from her caramel hair over the t-shirt that swamped her frame, to her dark sweats and her small feet. She looked so delicate, so easily breakable, even when he knew she was a fighter at heart, and her skills had been honed in battle against creatures far stronger than she was. She nodded.
When Persephone touched me, I felt strength flowing into me.
Strength that Marek could sense as he held her, and could see in her returning color and the brightness of her eyes. Yet he still didn't want to let her go and face their enemy alone. He didn't want to have to stand by and let her fight Eva. I'm not sure I can do this. He frowned and shook his head. The thought of you fighting. Her smile stole his heart.
Don't worry. I have this. It won't be the first time I've taken a beating, and I'll make it look convincing.
He wasn't worried about that. He was worried about what came after. He was worried about what the demons might do to her. All of that worry condensed inside him, compounding into a need to be alone with her, to hold her without his brothers watching and judging him, to show her that even when she was alone, she wasn't really alone. He was right there with her, because he loved her. I'll join you all in Tokyo. He gave Valen and Karis a pointed look, one he felt sure would make it clear he wouldn't change his mind, no matter what they said against the delay. Surprisingly, Karis just sighed and stepped, leaving black vapor behind. Valen smirked, waggled his fair eyebrows, and disappeared. He hadn't meant to give his brothers the impression that he wanted to be alone with Katerina so he could be intimate with her. But now that Valen had put it in his mind, he couldn't think about anything else. That desperate need to be close to her latched onto it, had him leading her from the cell and up the stairs to the ground floor, and then up the wooden staircase to his room. She nervously glanced around it as she entered ahead of him, her eyes straying to the four-poster bed that took up most of the room. I thought you might want to wash. The water is warm now. I could run a bath? He tamped down the nerves that tried to rise inside him as he moved past her, heading for the bathroom.
That would be nice.
She patted around his room, taking it all in, even going as far as peeking in his drawers. He didn't call her out on it. She could be nosy all she wanted as long as it took her mind off things. He wanted her to have a moment to breathe away from the craziness. He wanted things to be as they had been between them back in Barcelona, before his enemy had set their sights on her. The relief on her face, the calm that washed over it as she moved to the leaded window and looked out, at the loch and the mountains, said that she needed it. She needed a moment of normality. Marek focused on running the bath, giving her some time to enjoy the scenery, aware that she needed to erase the image of the underworld from her mind, and that the lush green of the Scottish countryside would help her do it. He peeked back in on her as the water thundered into the old clawfoot tub, and wasn't surprised that there were 3 white tulips blooming around her feet. His mother's way of offering comfort and showing Katerina that she wasn't alone. It was a relief that his mother had taken a shine to Katerina, would be keeping an eye on her from the underworld, and hopefully working on his father to make him see that Katerina wasn't the enemy or someone to despise. When the bath was full, he switched the water off and gathered soap and a washcloth for her, setting them on a shelf near it. He went to her where she still stood at the window, watching the seabirds, or at least he thought she had been watching them. He stopped beside her and tracked the line of her gaze and smiled. A seal bobbed in the water near the rocks, just its head breaking above the surface.
There's so much wildlife here.
She watched the seal, smiled as it dove beneath the surface, and kept her eyes on the water.
I think I saw a deer across the water, too.
It wouldn't surprise me. His arm brushed hers as he moved closer, and he couldn't resist the urge to take hold of her. He stepped behind her and wrapped his arms around her, looping them over her shoulders and drawing her back against his chest. We're miles from any roads here, and we own the land as far as the eye can see. Plenty of deer out there as well as other things. I saw a pine marten once. I swear it was going to swim to the island to raid the larder. She lifted both hands and curled them over his, and gods, it felt comfortable to hold her like this. Right. Her back pressed against his chest as she leaned her weight on him, and he settled his chin on top of her head and just held her, savoring how she felt in his arms, relishing the quiet of the moment and the feelings it stirred in him. I wish we could just stay here. Marek let the words fall from his lips, and waited. Katerina didn't keep him waiting long. She brushed her hands over his and sighed as she leaned more of her weight against him.
I wish we could, too.
Those words were ambrosia to him, the sweet taste of heaven.
But we can't.
She clutched his hand, and he sensed her mood shifting, darkening in a way that had him wanting to pull her back into the light and vanquish her doubts and fears, and keep her here with him, in this moment. I know. He held her tighter. Just let me have this for a while. I need it. She turned in his arms and pressed her palms to his chest, her eyes on the space between them where his heart beat for her.
I need it too.
Her hands shook against him, and doubt filled her eyes as she tilted her head back and looked up at him, edged with fear, and then pain as she looked away, turning her cheek to him. She tried to push out of his arms, but he held her closer, refusing to let her go, unwilling to let her believe whatever was spinning around her mind and tormenting her. Katerina, he murmured. When she lifted her head to look at him, he swooped on her lips and kissed her. She tensed, going rigid against him, but then she melted in his arms and her lips started a fevered dance over his. He groaned and twisted her loose t-shirt into his fists and clutched her to him as he angled his head and deepened the kiss, brushing her tongue with his and eliciting a soft moan from her.
We shouldn't.
She broke away from him and pushed against his chest when he tried to pull her back to him. He loosened his hold as she locked her elbows, afraid of hurting her with his strength. Why not? Her eyebrows furrowed and she looked away from him, and he knew what she wouldn't say. Because she hadn't been cured yet, and she thought he would only really want her if that happened, and he would break her heart if she remained a demon. Well, she was mistaken. He would never do anything to hurt her. She had become his entire world, vital to him, and he would move all the realms to keep her at his side and make her see that she belonged with him no matter what happened. He loved her. He wanted to tell her that, but he could see that she wasn't ready to hear it, and she wouldn't believe him if he did say it. Not until Megan had reversed what had been done to her. He would tell her then when he was sure that hearing it wouldn't hurt her, and she would believe that he was sincere and wasn't just saying something to make her feel better. Kiss me, he husked and tried to coax her to him. She resisted.
Why?
He frowned at her lips, aching to take them again. Because I need to kiss you. I need you, Katerina. You might not be afraid of what's going to happen, but I'm going out of my mind with worry. And not only about what was ahead of them. He worried about how he might react to her, that the darkness in his veins might rise to the fore and have him lashing out at her again when he didn't want to do such a thing. He stared down at her, studied his feelings, and picked them apart, and mulled over that night on the beach. It dawned on him that he hadn't reacted that way to her since that night, and hope built inside him. Was it possible that the shock of sensing she was a demon and his past had combined to cause that reaction? He would still be on his guard because he didn't want to hurt Katerina. Just the thought of hurting her caused him pain, and the thought of her in danger had him needing to hold her close, to savor every moment he had with her, and deepen the connection they shared so she would know she wasn't alone, so she would know how he felt about her. He removed his left arm from her waist and captured her cheek with his palm, ran his fingers along her jaw, and brushed his thumb over her lower lip. Gods, Katerina, I need this. I need you. Being pulled to the underworld, facing my father, knowing what's about to happen. I can't handle it. I don't know whether I'm coming or going, but this. He stroked her lip. You ground me, and I need to feel this again. I need this. He wasn't explaining it very well. He cursed, gritted his teeth, and growled, because he couldn't translate the feeling in his heart into words.
Deu, I need you too.
Katerina threw her arms around his neck and kissed him as she leaped into his embrace. He caught her and clutched her to him, kissed her hard as the need building inside him reached a crescendo, surging through his veins to obliterate all reason and control. Marek twisted with her and carried her to the bed as she kissed him, her lips playing on his, tongue teasing and stroking, driving him wild. He set her down on the mattress and covered her, caging her with his body. Her thighs fell open, welcoming him into the cradle of them, and he groaned as she wrapped her legs around him and pressed her heels into his backside, forcing him down into contact with her. Her heat scalded him through their sweats, had him grinding his erection against her as he mastered her mouth, a slave to the need she had awoken in him. She tangled her fingers in his hair and pulled his head up, gazed into his eyes with ones full of passion, need that burned inside him too.
What about my bath?
She murmured and stroked her hands down his throat, teasing his nape and then his shoulders. What about it? He lowered his gaze from her lips to her neck, dropped his head and kissed it as she tilted her head back, arching her breasts into his chest.
It'll get cold if we don't use it.
Her hands drifted down his spine and he groaned and licked her throat, teasing the spot below her earlobe as she tugged his t-shirt up. We won't fit in there together. He skimmed his hands down her side and mirrored her, pushing her t-shirt up to reveal the smooth plane of her stomach. He broke away from her lips and growled as he pushed to his knees between her thighs and took her in. Her hair cascaded across the dark covers, her rosy lips beckoning him for another kiss, and her eyes were dark, hungry as they dropped to his chest. Marek pulled his t-shirt off, obeying her unspoken command, and savored the way her face crumpled and she bit her lower lip, as if the sight of him had just completely undone her, or deeply satisfied her. Her legs lowered from his hips and her feet pressed against his thighs, pushing him backwards. He slid off the edge of the mattress and landed on his feet, forced himself to stand there and keep still as she moved onto her hands and knees and crawled towards him, the hunger in her eyes building as she raked them over him. A shiver tripped through him as she stroked her fingers down his chest and his stomach, swirled them around his muscles and kept tracking downwards. She leaned towards him and pressed wet kisses to each muscle on his stomach, following her hands lower. He swallowed when they hit the waistband of his sweats, tipped his head back and groaned as she ran her fingers along it, and the heel of her palms met his cock. She dipped her fingers behind the waistband, and her sweet moan as she brushed the blunt head had his hips jerking towards her, hot need rushing through his veins, a desire to hear her moaning like that as he filled her. She swirled her tongue around his navel and then disappeared. By the time he caught up and opened his eyes, she was kneeling on the bed in just her sweats, pushing them down her slender hips. His throat worked on another hard swallow as he watched her, as she teased him with a glimpse of her before she tugged the soft material back up. He frowned and groaned as he reached for her, the ache to see her naked building into something fierce and controlling. She smiled and a hint of blush colored her cheeks as her eyes darkened, as if she had seen that need she had created inside him and knew he was on the verge of losing himself to it. Rather than pulling her own sweats down, she reached for his, tugging them down his hips, freeing his cock. The cool air hit it, and it kicked against his stomach as he imagined the warmth of her hand on it, and burned with a need to feel it. She didn't make him wait long. She stroked her hand down the length of him from the blunt crown to his balls. He closed his eyes, lost in the way her hand felt, the softness of her touch as she explored him. It was too much. He gripped her wrist when she curled her fingers around him, not sure he would withstand such torment, not without making a fool of himself. Her eyes met his as he looked down at her, the wickedness in them saying he wasn't going to get his way. There would be no stopping her. Gods, he loved this woman. She had strength, knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to take it or fight him on it. She had stood up to his father and had stood up to him more than once. She had courage and fire. And damn, her mouth was wicked. He groaned as she wrapped her lips around him, as she suckled the head of his shaft in a way that had his eyes rolling back in his head. He sank forwards until his knees hit the edge of the mattress, giving him some support as she went to war on him. She gripped him with her hand, holding him at her mercy as she moved her mouth on him. Slow teasing pulls that propelled him to the edge of control, had him skirting the point where need would take over, leaving him a slave to his hungers. He wanted her right there with him. He pushed his fingers into her hair, twisted the spun caramel around them, and gripped her as he worked his hips, lost in the pleasure building inside him as she started to stroke him, obliterating his plans to push her to the edge. He groaned and frowned, clenched his jaw, and told himself to pull back on the reins, but he couldn't convince his body to listen to him. Not when Katerina was stroking him, sucking him, her wet heat gloving him. Release climbed to the base of his shaft. The urge to spill was strong, but somehow he forced himself to move, to push her backwards and break contact between them. He breathed hard as he stared down into her eyes, fighting for control over his body, slowly easing the tempest within him. Katerina lowered her hazel gaze to his cock, the look in her eyes warning she didn't intend to give him the moment he needed. He swept her up into his arms before she could take him back into her mouth and kissed her as he kicked his sweats off. She twisted in his arms, looped her legs around his waist, and rubbed against him, the feel of her breasts brushing his chest, and the heat of her against his aching length almost pushing him over the edge. "Katerina," he moaned, begging her to give him just a few seconds, enough time to get her out of her sweats. He lifted her, placed her over his shoulder, and weathered her frustrated grunt as she shoved her hands against his backside and pushed herself up. That grunt became a moan as he pulled her sweats down and off over her feet. Her panties followed them. Marek skimmed his hand over her bottom and gave it a light tap when she wriggled, just enough to leave a handprint on her right buttock. She huffed and smacked his arse hard enough that it stung. "It's like that, is it?" He hefted her, intending to toss her onto the bed. Only she twisted in his arms, wrapped her leg around his neck, and heaved backwards, sending him off balance. He tipped over her, his back hit the mattress, and she landed on top of him. Good gods! He wasn't sure he had ever been so turned on. He growled, seized her backside, and pulled her to him before she could make her next move, delving between her thighs. She moaned and shuddered above him as he stroked between her plush lips, tasting her sweetness. Her hands came down on his head and she arched, another trembling sigh escaping her as she rocked on his tongue, riding each stroke of it over her sensitive flesh. Marek was right there with her, moaning as he licked her, as he suckled and swirled his tongue around her bead, unable to get enough of her. Her sweet cries rose in pitch, her rocking growing more frantic, and he grinned as he pushed her higher still, towards that edge of losing control. She suddenly lifted her hips and slapped at his head when he pulled her back to him, refusing to release her. When she wriggled and loosed a frustrated noise, he reluctantly eased his grip on her because he didn't want her angry with him. "What's—" He didn't get a chance to finish asking her what was wrong. She took hold of his length and eased back, guiding him into her and destroying his ability to think. Feeling took over, had him seizing hold of her hips as she sank onto him, as he filled her and her warmth gloved him. She pressed her hands to his chest and rose off him, setting a pace that had his heart thundering and hips rising to meet hers. Her fingertips dug into his pectorals, short nails scoring his skin as she rode him, as she tipped her head back and moaned. Marek palmed her nape and pulled her down to him, kissed her hard as he worked his hips, matching her frantic pace. Ripples of pleasure collided and built into waves that crashed over him with each thrust of his hips, each plunge of his cock into her. She moaned and rocked, her desperate strokes pushing him to take her faster, harder, until that need that gripped her was satisfied.
Marek,
She murmured against his lips, painting them with his name spoken in a way he would always remember. She seared it on his heart as she clutched him to her, as she clung to him and he rolled her onto her back, wedging himself between her thighs. She surrendered to him, her head tipping back as he braced himself above her, planting one hand onto the mattress and the other beneath her lower back. He lifted her from the bed and angled his hips, filled her and stole the sweet cry of bliss that left her lips in a kiss. Her breaths came faster, mingling with his as he sank into her, as he curled his hand around her shoulder and shifted his knees, pressing them into the bed and using them as leverage. He groaned and lost himself in her, in the storm building between them, a wild tempest that would break at any moment, but one that would leave them forever changed. She clawed his shoulders, leaving her mark on him again, and kissed him deeper. Her hips rocked up to meet his as she plowed the fingers of her right hand into his hair and clutched him, and he groaned and shuddered as a hot shiver cascaded down his spine and his shaft grew harder. Katerina tightened around him as he filled her again. She jerked up against him and cried into his mouth, her thighs quivering against his hips as her body pulsed around him, propelling him over the edge with her. He groaned and shuddered as release swept through him, so swift and powerful that he could only hold Katerina as it took him, as every inch of him shook in response as he spilled inside her. She peppered his lips with kisses that had warmth following in the wake of his climax, feelings flowing through him that filled him with a need to hold her and never let her go, to keep her with him and not let her carry out their plan. He couldn't do that to her, though. She needed to do this, for him and for her brother. All he could do was keep her safe, and he would do that. Whatever happened, he would be there for her. He would see her through it all. Marek pulled back and looked down at her, stroked her cheek as he stared into her hazy, warm eyes that revealed more than she probably wanted him to see. She didn't have to fear. He couldn't get enough of her either. There was no one in this world more perfect for him than she was. He wrestled with the words again, even when he knew now wasn't the time. He would tell her later, when she was safely back in his arms, when she would believe that the heart pounding in his chest belonged to her, and it would forever, no matter what happened, because she was it for him.